Welcome to the empty boat, a place not made of walls or time, but of presence, where stories are not merely told, but breathed, where silence speaks louder than noise, and healing comes not through fixing, but through returning. Out here, you are not asked to believe, only to listen, to sit as you are, to breathe as the candle flickers in your inner room. Perhaps you've come with a heavy heart, or maybe just the faint ache of questions unanswered, the quiet exhaustion of holding on too tightly two things, two people, two certainty. This is a space for all of that, a gentle refuge in the turning of the world. Over the next few hours, you will journey through 25 Zen stories, each one a lantern left along the misty path, each one whispering, "You are not broken, you are remembering." These are not just tales, they are offerings. A falling leaf, still lake, a mirror turned inward. So pour some tea, let your breath soften, and let us begin, not with noise, but with stillness. You are now aboard the empty boat, and the current is already carrying you home. Story 1. The sound of one leaf falling. The first sound was so soft, it might have been imagined a whisper brushing against the moss, or the exhale of the forest itself. In the monastery deep in the pine-covered mountains, Master An sat motionless. Before dawn, the old wooden floor beneath him creaked with the cold, and a lantern barely illuminated the space around him. He had been sitting since the stars were still visible, listening not for words, not for omens, but for the nature of things. Down in the village, a young man named John was waking with a start. His fists were clenched even in sleep, his breath shallow, jaw tight. The dreams again, always dreams of running, always something chasing him that had no name. He sat up, wiped the sweat from his neck, and looked out toward the mountain. For weeks now, he had felt the pull. John was a man of structure, of ledgers and schedules, appointments and control. At 29, he managed his father's small logistics company and was widely admired for his efficiency. But lately, everything had begun to crumble, not visibly, not publicly. But inside, he was collapsing under the weight of his own perfection. His mother, before she passed, had told him once, when the river overflows, it doesn't ask your permission. He hadn't understood then. Now, with his relationships fraying, sleep elusive, and thoughts swirling like crows in a storm, John packed a bag and began the walk up the trail toward the temple. Master An said nothing when John arrived. He simply bowed and gestured to the courtyard where the autumn leaves had begun to scatter like stories that no longer needed telling. John bowed in return, awkwardly, and for the first time in months, said nothing. That afternoon, John swept leaves, and then again the next day, and the next. He swept in silence. At first, with agitation wanting to complete the task, then with confusion as the leaves returned endlessly with each breeze. Then, finally, with a kind of surrender. The act was not too clean. It was to see. Master An rarely spoke, but when he did, it was never direct. On the 5th evening, as dusk folded the sky into itself, the master sat beside John and pointed to a single leaf still clinging to the old persimmon tree in the yard. "Tell me," he said, "when will that leaf fall?" John looked. The leaf fluttered slightly, but held its place. "I don't know," John replied. "Good," the master said, nodding. "Now stop trying to know everything else." That night, John lay awake, not in panic, but in stillness. He listened to the wind. He imagined that leaf. He felt his chest rise and fall like the tide, unforced. The days passed slowly. Jun meditated. In the mornings, swept in the afternoons, and walked through the forest in the evenings. He noticed how the trees did not struggle to keep their leaves. They gave them freely to the season. The fox that crossed his path did not hesitate. It simply moved. The stream did not argue with the stones. It curved, flowed, sang dot, and then one morning it happened. A sound, not loud, not dramatic, just the soft, inevitable rustle of a single leaf letting go and landing on the stone path. It echoed through Chun's chest like a bell. He knelt beside it. He didn't pick it up. He simply bowed. Later, he would speak to the master. "I heard the leaf fall," he said, "and for a moment I thought maybe I can let go too." Master An smiled with his eyes. "You already are." In the weeks that followed, Jun learned, not by grasping, but by noticing. He began to see how control had been his shield, his armor against uncertainty. But in wielding it so tightly, he had strangled his own life relationships. Laughter, even grief, had become things to schedule, manage, avoid. One afternoon, the master shared a story. "There was once a man," he began, "who spent his days chasing birds in a golden cage. He was told that happiness was in possession, in plans, in holding everything tightly. But the more he filled his cage, the heavier it became. Until one day, walking along the river, he fell in on the cage pulled him under. In his final breath, he opened the door and the birds flew out. Light returned. But he was already gone." Jun was silent. The metaphor was not lost on him. In Buddhist teachings, the desire to control arises from fear, fear of loss, of pain, of the unknown. But everything is impermanent, even fear. To control the wind is to suffer. To ride with it is to be free. And in modern life, many walk with invisible cages. We overplan, overthink, overwork not because we are strong, but because we are afraid to feel weak, afraid to trust life. Jun remembered how he had micromanaged his employees until they stopped trusting themselves. How he had distanced himself from his girlfriend the moment she became vulnerable because he didn't know how to hold her pain without fixing it. How even at his mother's funeral, he'd organized every detail but never cried. Control had been his identity, and it had cost him presence. But now, up here, among pines and silence, he was learning to surrender, not in failure, but in faith. One morning, as the sun spread golden light across the mountains, Jun sat beneath the persimmon tree. The last of the leaves had fallen. He looked at the bare branches and did not feel loss. He felt space, and in that space, peace. He would return to the village, not to escape, not to fix, but to live. Before leaving, he asked Master An one final question. "What if I forget this feeling?" The master looked at him gently. "Then listen again for the sound of one leaf falling. It's always happening, somewhere inside." John walked down the trail with his bag light and heart lighter. The world had not changed, but he had. He no longer needed to grip the steering wheel of life so tightly he could breathe. He could let things be, and when storms came, and they would, he knew now, a falling leaf makes no resistance. It simply lets go. Those who cling to perceptions and views wander the world offending people. Letting go, they find peace. Buddha Dhammapada reflection. What are you still trying to control that may no longer serve you? Can you sit quietly today and just watch your thoughts fall like leaves without grabbing them? Sleep meditation prompt. Tonight, you lie down, imagine yourself as the tree. Each breath out, let a single leaf fall. a regret, a worry, tightness. Let them fall and fall until all that remains is space and the soft wind of being. Story 2. Tea. For the uninvited guest, the village market was bustling. Bells chimed gently from the shop doors, and the scent of warm bread and dried herbs hung in the morning air. At the far end of the street, nestled between a quiet pottery stall and an old herbalist's table, stood a small tea house. It wasn't grand, nor did it boast signs or music, but everyone knew it because, inside, time seemed to breathe differently. Old May, the woman who owned the tea house, moved slowly. Her hands bore the soft tremble of age, but her eyes were as clear as a mountain stream. Locals often said she poured silence into her tea, and somehow it made the world taste sweeter. One late afternoon, as the last of the sun dipped behind the roofs, a traveler burst into the tea house. He was tall, lean, with eyes like a tightened fist. His clothes were stained with road dust, and a sharp edge clung to him like something barely held back. He threw his pack to the floor and dropped into a seat near the back, far from the others. His jaw clenched with each breath, his fingers tapping violently against the wooden table. Old May walked over slowly and stood beside him. She did not ask him what he wanted. Instead, she bowed her head slightly and disappeared behind the curtain. Minutes later, she returned with a single clay teacup and a small blackened kettle. Without a word, she poured. Steam curled upward, catching the fading light. The tea was dark and fragrant, with notes of roasted barley and plum. The man stared at it. "I didn't order," he said. May sat across from him. "No one invites anger," she said, "but it comes, so we pour it tea." The man's eyes narrowed. "I'm not angry." May smiled softly. "Of course not." The man's lip curled. "I came here to forget, not to talk in riddles." May lifted her own cup and sipped. Then, "Let us not talk, let us drink." For a while, nothing was said. The sound of the kettle cracking slightly in the cooling air filled the silence. Then, as though something had loosened in the steam, the man spoke. "I lost everything." May did not respond. "My brother," he continued. "He took it, the business, the land, lied to our father while he was dying, made it all legal." May's eyes lowered. "I worked my hands to the bone for that place, for him, for our name, and now I'm just nothing." The man's hands curled into fists again. "He sent me a letter, inviting me to come back, to talk." He looked at May as if expecting judgment. "I nearly burned it." May reached into her sleeve and brought out a small brush and a rice paper slip. She dipped the brush into the tea and wrote a single character. "Sin, heart," she said. "Do you know why I write with tea?" The man shook his head. "Because anger stains more than ink." She turned the paper so he could see. "When the heart burns, it tries to send smoke through the mouth. We lash, we curse, we clench." He swallowed. "But when you pour tea for it, instead, you listen." The man lowered his gaze. May continued. "In Zen, there is a story. A monk lived at the edge of a forest. One day, a man stormed in, demanding shelter. The monk welcomed him and offered food. The man ate in silence, trembling with rage. That night, he broke the monk's altar, insulted the Buddha, and stormed out. The man listening clenched his jaw. The villagers came the next morning. Furious, they asked the monk why he did nothing, why he allowed the insult. "What did he say?" the traveler asked. May smiled faintly. "He said, The man came with fire in his chest. Why should I become kindling? The traveler looked down at his tea. It had cooled, the surface now still and dark like a pond at night. I wanted to go back there, he said. Show him what he did. Make him feel what I felt. He hesitated. But I knew I would become the very thing I hated. May nodded. There's this part of me, he continued, that wants peace. But there's another, part furious, wounded, proud. I don't know which one is real. May leaned forward. Both are guests. The man looked up. In the practice of mindfulness, she said, we learn to open the door to every guest. Anger, sadness, even betrayal. Not to indulge them, but to greet them. Pour them tea. Watch them, let them pass. She poured a second cup and placed it before him. This one, she said, is for your anger. The man stared at the cup. What if it doesn't leave? May smiled, then keep pouring. One day it will grow tired of your kindness. He laughed, softly, the first sound of warmth from him all day. The tea house dimmed as the lanterns were lit. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the wind chimes. May stood and began to clear the cups. The man stood, too. Thank you, he said. I think I'll visit my brother. Not to fight, just to sit. Maybe pour him some tea. May bowed. As he reached the door, she called after him. When you go, bring an empty cup. He turned. Why? She winked. So your heart has room. He smiled and stepped into the evening light. In Buddhist teaching, anger is like a torch held in bare hands meant to strike others, but always burning the one who holds it. Yet modern life encourages us to act fast, to respond instantly, to fight for our pride. We rarely pause to ask, is this the kind of fire I want to carry? In psychology, anger is understood not as a root emotion, but as a signal and alarm, often covering grief, helplessness, or deep hurt. If we pour tea for it, as old May teaches, we learn to listen. Beneath rage, we may find sorrow. Beneath sorrow, longing. Beneath longing, love. And perhaps a heart ready to open again. Pour tea for your anger, not to feed it, but to understand it. Sit with it long enough, and you may sit, too, is tired of burning. Let it rest, let it soften, let it go. Those who have hurt you may never ask for forgiveness, but your peace does not need their permission. Drink your tea slowly tonight, and leave an empty cup by your heart. Story 3. The empty teacup. In the rain had begun before dawn, gentle, persistent, like a hand tapping on the shoulder of the world. It coated the old temple roof in a shimmering sheen, whispered across the leaves of the plum trees, and dripped softly from the wooden beams of the meditation hall. Inside the hall was dim and cool. Candles flickered along the wall, casting long shadows on the wooden floor. At the center, a single teacup sat on a low stone ledge beside the open window, slowly filling with rain. Yun, a novice monk of just 24, sat beside it, unmoving. His robes were damp at the edges, his breath shallow, his brow furrowed as though he were trying to solve some invisible equation. He had been sitting there for hours long after the morning bell, long after the others had gone to breakfast. Master? Riku watched him from a distance. The old monk's face, carved by time and weather, was calm. He said nothing, just listened to the hush of the rain. Later that day, as Yun carried out his chores, chopping wood, sweeping the pathways, scrubbing the temple's stone steps, he remained silent. Even when spoken to, he gave only a nod or a tight-lipped smile, The brothers noticed. The air around Yoon had grown heavier. That evening, Master Riku found him again beside the same ledge. The teacup was still there, now brimming with cold rainwater. "You've been watching that cup," the master said softly. "What do you see?" Yoon looked down. "It's too full," he said. "It's overflowing, and I don't know how to stop it." Riku stepped beside him, his knees cracking with age as he slowly crouched. "And is that cup you?" Yoon nodded once. The master said nothing for a while. They both listened as a new drop of rain landed on the surface, causing a quiet ripple, then spilled over the edge. "I try to be calm," Yun said finally. "I sit, I breathe, I chant, but there's too much inside. Thoughts, regrets, questions. I can't answer." Riku reached out and gently tipped the cup, pouring some of the water onto the earth below. Then he placed it back. "Now," he said, "there's room." Yun looked down, his throat tightened. The old man continued. "There's a saying from long ago, you cannot pour tea into a cup that is already full." "I've heard that," Yun said. "But it's not just about learning," Riku said. "It's about presence, about letting go. This life, these thoughts, they come like rain. You can't stop the clouds, but you can choose whether to sit in the storm, trying to hold every drop, or tilt the cup." Yoon lowered his head. "I feel like I have to carry it all," he whispered. "The past, the pressure. My family back home, they expect me to succeed, to bring back something of meaning. But I'm here, and I feel like I'm failing even at silence." The master gently placed a hand on Yoon's shoulder. "Failing at silence is just another form of trying too hard. You are not here to be empty. You are here to see." They sat together as the rain thickened, washing the courtyard in silver threads in the days that followed. Yoon returned to his practice, but something had softened. He no longer tried to push his thoughts away. Instead, he watched them come and go like rain on a pond. Some were loud, others quiet, some painful, others absurd, but all passed. He noticed that the more he stopped resisting, the more space he felt inside. One afternoon, Master Riku gathered the monks for a teaching. He held up the teacups, one full to the brim, the other empty. "Cup receives the rain?" he asked. "The empty one," someone answered. "Which one reflects the sky?" "The empty one." "And which one do we carry most often?" "Silence, then." Yoon spoke. "The full one. We fill it with thoughts, expectations, past mistakes." Riku nodded. "And what happens when more comes?" "It spills," Yoon said. The master looked round. "We are taught to hold knowledge, to collect plans, to cling to identities. But none of that brings peace. Peace comes not from fullness, but from space." That night Yoon sat again by the window. The teacup was there, as always. This time, he poured its rainwater gently into the earth before sitting beside it. He imagined his thoughts like droplets falling, rippling, fading. He no longer feared the rain in Buddhism. The mind is often compared to a mirror or a still lake, but in modern life, we filled that mirror with dust, with noise, with our own self-talk. We carry endless thoughts, anxieties, projections. The result is overwhelmed, not because of life itself, but because of how tightly we cling to every dot in psychology. The brain's default mode network lights up when we ruminate, cycling through regrets of the past or worries of the future. Mindfulness doesn't eliminate these thoughts. It creates a new relationship with them. It teaches us to tilt the cup, to see a thought, acknowledge it, and let it pass like rain through fingers. Yoon's struggle is our own. We want clarity, yet we refuse to empty. We want stillness, yet we cling to storm. But when we stop trying to fix, and instead allow, something shifts. The water settles. The sky reflects again. Let the cup overflow when it must. Then tip it gently and sit with space. That is where peace begins. Story 4. Footprints on wet stone. It had rained through the night. The kind of rain that seemed less about falling and more about soaking quiet, insistent, cleansing. By morning, the temple courtyard was veiled in mist, and every surface glistened. Moss, leaves, roof tiles, even the ancient stones leading to the meditation hall. Koji, the temple's groundskeeper, was the first to rise. He moved slowly, almost reverently, carrying his broom like a staff. For 37 years he had tended the temple, yet he still bowed each morning before sweeping the first leaf. He believed in beginnings, no matter how many had come before. As he crossed the stone path toward the gate, he noticed something unusual. Footprints, fresh, clear, barefoot, and small. They curved gently from the entrance, through the center of the yard, and vanished beneath the great pine tree near the edge of the cliff. Koji knelt beside one of them, inspecting its shape. It was the foot of a child, but the temple had no children. He stood slowly, heart steady but curious. Following the prints, he reached the base of the pine tree and paused. There was nothing, no child, no sign. Only the sound of a bird calling somewhere in the fog. Later that morning, he mentioned it to Master Dago. The old master simply nodded, sipping his tea. Some footprints are meant to be seen, he said. Some are meant to disappear. Koji was not satisfied with that. He asked if anyone had come in the night, or if a child from the village might have wandered up. No one had. The rain had made the path nearly impassable. Even the monks had stayed in their quarters that night. As the fog returned and shadows stretched long across the stones, Koji lit incense and sat by the gate, watching. In the soft glow of the lantern, the stones shimmered again. And then, for a moment, he saw her. A girl, no more than 7 or 8, walking slowly along the path barefoot. Her hair long and dark, her eyes distant. She didn't look at Koji. She didn't seem to see anything. She just walked, then paused at the pine tree and disappeared into the mist. Koji did not chase her. He only bowed. The next morning, he returned to the spot. Again, footprints. Again, they vanished beneath the pine. This went on for 7 nights. Each time the girl came, walked, vanished. On the 8th day, Koji found Master Dago waiting beside the path. He did not speak. He held a small brush and a blank scroll. When the girl appeared, he watched quietly, then dipped the brush in water and painted a single long stroke down the parchment. That is her path, he said. It leaves no ink, only presence. Koji turned to him. Who is she? Dago looked at him for a long moment, then said, She is not a ghost. She is memory, yours. Koji's breath caught. When you were 7, Dago continued, you were brought here. Your parents had died. You had no words for grief, so you walked these paths in silence. I watched you. Each morning, you left your footprints here. Then one day, you stopped. Koji swallowed hard. He remembered the cold stone, the silence, the aching absence. I forgot, he whispered. You buried it, Dago said. But now, it walks again. Not to haunt you, to remind you. Koji looked back at the stones. The prints were fading in the sun. She never looked at me, he said. She didn't need to, Dago replied. She knew you were watching. That is enough. That night, Koji did not sit by the gate. Instead, he went to the pine tree. He lit incense, placed a small flower at its roots, and knelt. I see you, he whispered, and I thank you. The girl did not come again, but Koji did not forget her. Years passed, seasons turned. Koji's hair grayed, his back bent, but he swept the path each day with the same quiet care. And once a year, on the morning after the first rain of spring, he placed a small flower beneath the pine. Some footprints are made not by flesh, but by sorrow. Some vanish not because they are gone, but because they have been seen in Buddhist practice. The past is not an enemy, nor is it a prison. It is a teacher that appears when the student is ready, not in memory alone, but in sensation, in dreams, in echoes. In modern life, we are taught to move forward, to discard what hurts. But the body remembers. The heart remembers. And when we deny the past, it returns not as history, but as shadow psychology speaks of repressed memory, unresolved trauma, and the way childhood grief can echo silently into adult life. But awareness, gentle, patient awareness can bring integration. The child Koji once was had not vanished. He had waited beneath the pine for decades, asking only to be seen. And when he was, he could rest. Perhaps there is a child in you too, walking quietly through the corridors of your life, not to disrupt, not to confuse, but to be met, not fixed, not analyzed, just held. When it rains next, watch the stone, see what rises, bow to the footprints, and let them fade. Story 5. When the lantern goes out, the mountain village of Hoshino stood at the edge of the world, or so it felt to those who lived there. Encircled by pine forests and deep mist, its houses clung to the hillside like thoughts to memory. In the heart of this village sat a tiny temple with a single lantern hanging by its wooden gate. That lantern had burned for over 70 years. It was said to have been lit by the temple's first abbot, a monk who arrived after the war with nothing but a begging bowl and a heart still heavy from what he had seen. He never spoke of his past. He only tended to the garden, mended roofs, and taught the village children how to breathe. Each night, before the temple doors were closed, he would light the lantern. It was a soft, golden flame, a simple light, but the villagers came to believe that as long as the lantern remained lit, the village would be protected from hunger, from sorrow, from forgetting. When he passed away, the duty of lighting the lantern was passed down, first to his student, then to the next, and then to the next. It became ritual, sacred now. Many years later, that task belonged to Sora. He was not a monk, not officially. He had come to the temple 2 years ago after losing his wife to illness. Grief had led him there like a rope pulled through his chest. He had arrived thin, withdrawn, and sleepless. The monks did not ask his story. They simply gave him a place to sit, to sweep, to breathe. In time, Sora found himself staying, not because the pain had gone, but because it had become quieter in the presence of pine trees and temple bells. Lighting the lantern became his task, and he did it faithfully, until one night it went out. It had been a cold, wet evening. Wind howled through the valley. The flame, even beneath its glass covering, flickered violently. Sora lit it 3 times. Each time, it died within moments. He tried shielding it with his coat. He tried whispering prayers, but the lantern would not stay lit. He stood in the rain, drenched and uncertain. Something inside him stirred a panic. He thought he had buried The villagers would notice. They would worry. The light had never gone out, and now, in his hands, it had. That night, Sora could not sleep. He sat by the unlit lantern, staring into the darkness. He thought of his wife's final hours, how her breath had become shallow, how no matter how tightly he held her hand, he could not hold her here. He remembered the machines, the sterile white walls, the silence after he had not cried that day. Not really. He had simply gone numb. The lantern's flame felt like her breath. And now, again, it was gone. Before dawn, Master Kenzo, the temple's abbot, came and sat beside him. I heard the wind was strong last night. The master said gently. Sora nodded, his eyes hollow. The lantern went out. Kenzo looked up, at the sky where the first hints of blue were breaking through. Sometimes it does. Sora turned to him. But it's never gone out before. Not in 70 years. Kenzo nodded. Yes, but 70 years is not eternity. Sora's voice cracked. I failed. Kenzo smiled sadly. No, you witnessed the truth. Sora looked down. The truth, Kenzo continued, is that all flames go out, even sacred ones, even the ones we love. He paused. But listen, the two men sat in silence. From the east, a single bird began to call. Then another and another. The light is not in the lantern, Kenzo said. It is in the dawn. Sora closed his eyes. His breath trembled. She loved mornings, he whispered. Kenzo bowed his head. Then she is here. Later that day, Sora returned. To the lantern, it was still damp, still cool. He cleaned it slowly, carefully. Then, as the sun dipped once more beyond the mountains, he struck the match again. The flame returned. Small, steady. But this time, Sora did not light it with desperation. He lit it with acceptance, because he knew now when it goes out again, it will not be a failure. It will be a reminder that everything we love must pass, and yet nothing we love is ever truly lost. In Zen, there is a saying, when the candle burns out, the space remains. In grief, we often seek permanence. We build shrines in the heart, cling to old messages, rehearse last moments over and over. We fear forgetting. We fear the silence after the flame. But in Buddhist wisdom, impermanence is not the enemy, it's the teacher. It invites us to love without grasping, to hold without possessing, to live knowing all things are borrowed. Modern psychology echoes this. In grief therapy, healing does not mean moving on, but moving forward with. We carry the essence, the memory, the imprint in it, in fire, but in air. Sora's grief did not end that day, but it changed shape. He no longer held the flame in his hands. Afraid to lose it, he lit it each evening as an offering, not to ward off sorrow, to honor it. And when, years later, he passed the task to another, he left behind no instructions, only a single sentence carved into the wood beneath the lantern. When the light goes out, look to the sky. There are nights when we feel the flame inside us dim, flicker, vanish. We panic, we mourn. But then, if we listen, we may hear the bird calling, the soft wind, the breath of someone once loved. Not all light is fire. Some comes with dawn, some with memory, and some perhaps the deepest of all comes when the lantern goes out and we learn to see in the dark. Story 6. The bamboo that bent but did not break at the southern edge of the old Zen temple stood a grove of bamboo. It was not marked on any map, nor was it spoken of often, but every monk who had spent a season there knew its presence, how it hummed gently in the wind, how it danced during storms, and how, despite the years, not one stalk had ever snapped in the winter of his 31st year. Ryota came to the temple broken. He had not shaved his head, nor worn the robe. He was not seeking enlightenment. He was seeking relief from the unbearable pain that had settled in his chest after the collapse of everything he thought he could control. Ryota had once been a rising name in architecture. Precision, deadlines, clean lines, a reputation built, like scaffolding. Then came the building collapse, a miscalculation, a beam misaligned. The reports were cold, the media colder. He watched his name crumble, his firm vanish, and worst of all, he watched a worker's family weep on live television. No words, just weeping. He had not spoken in weeks by the time he arrived. The monks welcomed him without questions. They gave him a bed, a bowl, and space. That was all. For days, Ryota wandered the grounds. He did not speak. He ate little. He watched the sky, sometimes for hours. Silence wrapped him, not as comfort, but as numbness. One morning, a monk named Tetsu found him sitting near the bamboo grove, staring. "You like them?" Tetsu asked. Ryota didn't answer. "They're stronger than they look," Tetsu continued, "but they don't resist." Still, no response. "Come back tomorrow," Tetsu said gently, "before the sun rises." Ryota returned. The air was cold, his breath visible. Tetsu stood already among the bamboo, waiting. Without speaking, he beckoned Ryota to follow. They walked in silence through the grove. The stalks arched over them like ribs, like prayer. A wind stirred. The bamboo swayed hundreds of green columns bending deeply, touching the earth. Ryota flinched, expecting breakage, but none came. The wind passed. The bamboo stood again. They move. Tetsu finally said, "Because they do not resist. Even the strongest storm cannot break what yields." Ryota looked at the forest. "So, I'm weak because I fought it." "No," Tetsu said. "You're suffering because you expected to stay straight." That day, Ryota asked for a rake and began helping tend the garden. It was the first time he had spoken. Over the next weeks, he rose earlier, swept longer, ate slowly. He still felt the ache, but it was no longer drowning him. In its place was something quieter, a presence. One afternoon, he joined the monks in zazen. At first, sitting still was unbearable. His body twitched, his mind screamed, but each time he wanted to flee, he remembered the bamboo. He stayed. Eventually the stillness stopped being punishment. It became invitation. He began to cry often, not in loud sobs, but in quiet streams, like sap from a wounded tree. No one interrupted, no one advised. The tears were enough then. One day, the abbot, Master Shoin, called him for tea. They sat in a small room with a single scroll on the wall that read, Mu, meaning nothingness. Master Shoin poured 2 cups, then spoke. "I heard about your building," he said, without judgment. Ryota's shoulders stiffened. "I once designed a bridge," Shoin continued. "Before I became a monk, it collapsed too. A farmer died." Ryota's eyes widened. Shoin nodded. "I left engineering, not because I failed, but because I didn't understand what failure was." He took a sip. "Everything in the world breaks, eventually. Stone erodes. Steel rusts. Even truth bends with time. The question is never how to stay unbroken, The question is how to bend with grace. Ryota looked down at his tea. But I took a life. No, Shoin said gently. An accident took a life, and your guilt is trying to take yours. Ryota began to tremble. You must mourn, Shoin said, and then you must bow, not to the past, but to the present, to the wind, to the bend. That evening, Ryota returned to the bamboo grove. He knelt. He whispered an apology to the man he'd never known, to the name he'd lost, to the perfection he could never keep. Then he bowed deeply, his forehead to the earth. He stayed there a long time. In Buddhist teaching, resilience is not the refusal to fall, but the ability to rise again. The bamboo is a master of this flexible, humble, grounded. It yields, but never surrenders. Modern life often equates resilience with toughness, productivity, stoicism, but this leads to suppression, not healing. True psychological resilience means allowing emotion, feeling fully, adapting gently, letting yourself be changed without being destroyed. Ryota thought strength meant holding up a building now, he saw. It meant knowing when to kneel beneath the storm. In time, Ryota left the temple. He did not return to architecture, not immediately. Instead, he took up woodwork in a quiet coastal town, crafting furniture from fallen bamboo. He worked slowly, mindfully. He no longer sought to build tall things. He sought to build things that could last by bending. People would ask him why he only used bamboo. He would answer simply, because it knows how to survive. So, when the wind howls through your life, when the loss feels unbearable and the shame too loud, remember the bamboo. You are allowed to bend. You are not here to shatter. You are here to sway. Weep, kneel, and rise, again and again. That is how the bamboo survives, and how the heart, too, learns to stay. Story 7. A bowl without a name there was an old wooden shelf in the main hall of Jojin Temple, where bowls of past masters were kept. Each was placed carefully on a linen cloth, labeled with a name and the years they had served the scepter. Some bowls were cracked, others patched with gold in the style of kintsugi. All bore the marks of age, of use, of reverence. All but one, the final bowl on the shelf, had no name. It was simple, undecorated, clay-colored, with a faint swirl at its center. No plaque, no history. Just a bowl. No one remembered who it had belonged to. When new monks arrived, they often asked. The elder monks would smile and say, that one belonged to someone who stopped needing a name. For years, the bowl sat untouched, until Haku came. Haku was not a monk. He was a scholar, a philosopher by trade, with books that bore his name in embossed lettering and long lectures delivered in echoing halls. But none of that mattered anymore. After a humiliating scandal involving fabricated sources and a former student who had exposed him, Haku disappeared from public view. He came to Jogin Temple on the quietest day of spring. His suitcase still had the tag from the university. His face was drawn, his eyes flickering with shame and something close to despair. He didn't ask for a teaching. He asked for silence. They gave him both. Haku took to temple life with the same rigor he had once applied to academia. He rose before dawn, meditated with the others, copied sutras with delicate care. He cleaned the latrines, washed rice, tended moss between stone slabs. He followed the rules perfectly, precisely, but something in him remained tight. The same grip that once held knowledge like a sword now tried to hold stillness like a shield. He bowed deeper than needed, chanted louder than necessary, and when no one watched, he often walked the corridors muttering phrases from old books, as though reminding himself that he still knew. One afternoon, during tea preparation, Haku was assigned to fetch bowls from the main hall. It was his first time handling the master shelf. He carried each bowl as if it were relic and ceremony in one. When he reached the unnamed bowl, he paused. It felt warm, not from the sun or the room, but from something else, something he could not name. He brought the bowl to the tea master. "Who does this belong to?" he asked. The tea master looked at it and smiled. "Who do you think? I don't know." "Then perhaps you are ready to use it." Haku frowned. "Shouldn't it be preserved?" The tea master shrugged. "A bowl is not sacred because it sits untouched. It is sacred because it holds." From that day on, Haku was given the unnamed bowl during tea. At first, it unnerved him. He searched through the temple's archives, hoping to find a record. Nothing. He asked the elders. They only laughed gently. One even said, perhaps it belonged to a monk who forgot himself so completely that the bowl forgot too. Haku found that infuriating. How could something important have no history, no lineage, no name? He began dreaming of the bowl. In one dream, he saw it rolling down a hillside into a river. In another, he watched someone wash it clean until the swirl at the bottom dissolved. He woke from these dreams unsettled, with the bowl's silence ringing in his chest. One evening, during a community reflection, Master Raya came to speak. "The ego," he said, "is like a label on a bowl. It tells the world what we are, what we do, what we've accomplished. But beneath the label, the bowl remains the same. And when the label is gone only, then can the bowl be used for anything?" Haku felt a sting in those words. For years, he had shaped his identity with accolades, citations, intellectual dominance. And when that was taken, he had believed he was nothing. But perhaps he was finally only a bowl. One night, unable to sleep, Haku sat before the master shelf. The moonlight cut across the wooden floor, soft and silver. He took the unnamed bowl and placed it in his lap. "I was someone once," he whispered. "I was a voice people listened to, and now I'm no one." The bowl said nothing. Haku closed his eyes. "If I let go of everything of my name, my guilt, my need to be seen, remains." He sat like that for hours, holding the bowl, asking no one in particular, and in that stillness, he began to cry. Not with shame, but with release. The kind of weeping that comes when the armor falls and the soul, raw and naked, touches the air. For the first time in years, when morning came, he placed the bowl back on the shelf. But now it felt different. Not because it had changed, but because he had. He stopped reciting books aloud, stopped trying to prove. He began to listen more, speak less. He smiled more freely. When he laughed, it was not from cleverness, from a quiet joy. He started sharing tea with the younger monks, and once even asked one for advice. Years passed. Haku never returned to the university, never published again. But the villagers came to know him as the man who listened, who made the best tea, who remembered everyone's name if he no longer held tightly to his own. When he died, he left no possessions, only a note: let the bowl remain. Let it hold what it will. The bowl was placed back on the shelf, still unnamed, still enough in Zen teaching. Emptiness is not nothingness, is spaciousness, the absence of fixed identity, the willingness to be used by life in whatever way life calls. The ego clings to titles, roles, reputations. But the self beyond ego is like the bowl, open, ready, undefined. In modern psychology, identity foreclosure, when we attach too tightly to who we think we are, can lead to deep distress when life takes that identity away. Healing comes when we can grieve what was, but also rediscover what always is, a self not made of labels, but of awareness. To be a bowl without a name is not to be erased, it is to be free. May you too one day sit with your own bowl and find in its silence the shape of your truest self. Story 8. The bell that rings without a hand. There was a bell in the northern corridor of Sijin Temple. It did not hang in the main hall where ceremonies took place, nor was it part of the grand bronze chimes that marked the hour. This bell was small, plain, slightly rusted at the rim. It hung from a wooden beam beside the corridor wall that overlooked the koi pond, half hidden by a curtain of ivy. And yet every monk knew it well, because no one ever rang it, and still sometimes it rang. Not often, perhaps once a season, maybe twice, always at moments when the air felt charged with some unnamed awareness, a silence before a summer storm, a sudden stillness at dusk. Then, without warning, a single, clear note would rise and echo softly through the stones and the leaves. No one could explain it. No breeze strong enough to move it. No bird ever seen brushing against it. Some said it was the wind of karma. Others called it the echo of past lives. A few, with a smile, whispered that it rang when the mountain sighed. But the bell became more than a mystery. It became a mirror. Each time it rang, the monks paused. They stopped mid-stride, mid-sentence, mid-thought, not out of superstition, but reverence, as if the world itself had decided to call their attention back, not with thunder, but with a single, silver thread of sound. When Yuki first arrived at the temple, she noticed the bell but thought little of it. She was a city-born therapist who had spent years studying trauma, anxiety, and mindfulness in clinical settings. She had come to the temple not as a spiritual seeker, but as a researcher. Her goal was to observe monastic life for a paper she was writing on long-term meditative environments. She carried notebooks, a voice recorder, and the faint pride of someone used to measuring silence in charts and graphs. Her questions were sharp. Her analysis was precise. She documented meal patterns, breathing rhythms, even blink rates during zazen. But there was something she could not record. The bell, she heard it for the first time during her 3rd week. It was just after sunset. The monks were gathered for evening chant. A soft breeze passed through the open corridor. And then one note, high, clear, hollow. Yuki's head snapped toward the sound. No one moved. Then, slowly, the chanting resumed. She waited until the ceremony ended, then approached one of the younger monks, who rang the bell. She asked. He smiled. No one. She frowned. It had to be someone, or something. He bowed slightly. That is always the question. She began monitoring it, setting up a small camera, observing the area from a distance. She even placed sensors to track wind speed, motion, vibration, but nothing triggered the bell. Nothing measurable. Just, sometimes it rang, and each time it did, something stirred inside her. Not fear, not awe, something stranger. A recognition. She began to sit longer in meditation. At first, to clear her mind for observation. Then, because she needed it, old emotions rose. A pain in her chest she couldn't explain. Memories of her father's silence after her mother died. The way she had thrown herself into books to escape feeling, the loneliness of being brilliant and untouched. She had thought she came to study stillness, but it was beginning to study her. One morning, after the bell had rung once again without cause, she found herself speaking to Master Guinan. "Why does it ring?" He smiled, eyes soft. "Why do you think? I don't know," she said. "But it always happens when I'm holding something I can't name. Something old." He nodded. "The bell does not know your name, but it knows when you are not here." She looked at him, puzzled. "There are parts of us," he said, "that ring like that bell, without touch, without intention, just the presence of truth." He gestured toward the garden. "A thought you've never spoken, a grief never wept, a joy never shared. These live in you, silent and waiting." Then a breeze, a sound, a line of poetry, and they ring. Yuki exhaled slowly. "So the bell isn't magic." He shook his head. "It's a teacher." She began sitting beside the bell each evening, not to catch it. To listen, she listened without a goal, without a thesis. Just breath, trees, stone, and silence. Stopped one night, under the full moon. She began to weep. Not from sadness, not from beauty, from something in between. The way a leaf falls when no one is watching. The way a child lets go of a balloon. She wept, and the bell did not ring, but she felt it inside her, and it was enough. In the weeks that followed, she wrote nothing. No notes, no analysis. She simply lived. She scrubbed pots, carried water, chanted sutras with the others. When she left, she did not take recordings, only a single line in her journal. The bell rang, and so did I. In Zen, awakening is not always thunderous. It is often a single chime in the heart, unexpected and unprovoked. It is a pause, a breath, a tear, the echo of presence in a distracted life. In psychology, we speak of triggers, moments when the body remembers what the mind has long buried. But not all triggers are painful. Some awaken, some heal, some remind us that we are still here. You do not always need to be struck to awaken. Sometimes you just need to listen. There is a bell in you. It rings when you're not looking. It rings when the soul stretches quietly in sleep, when grief breathes beneath the laughter, when stillness finds you after years of noise. Listen, not with your ears, with your life. Story 9. In the garden of unfinished statues at the edge of the valley, beyond the cedar groves and rice paddies, there stood a crumbling stone wall, moss-covered and split in places by the patient hands of time. Behind it lay a garden unlike any other in the region, a garden filled not with flowers or trees, but with statues, hundreds of them, faces half-carved, arms missing, torsos still rough with chisel marks. Some leaned, others had collapsed entirely. None were complete. It was said that the garden had been started generations ago by a sculptor who had vowed to create 1,000 bodhisattvas, each unique, each bearing the compassion of enlightenment. He had reached only 173 before he passed. His tools left where his hands had fallen. No one ever finished them. No one dared. The villagers believed it was sacred not because of what it was, but because of what it remained unfinished. Over the years, moss crept over, the forms like green robes. Rain washed their faces into deeper silence. The garden became a place where no one spoke loudly. Even the children ran quieter, as if the statues themselves were listening. When Hannah first came to the village, she was looking for something she couldn't name. She had just walked away from a life most would envy, a well-paying job in design, a modern apartment in the city, friends who laughed but rarely listened. But inside, she felt a void, as if her entire life had been chiseled for display and not for dwelling. She came to the village to teach art at the school. The locals welcomed her with gentle curiosity. They had heard she was skilled. They had heard she had left without reason. One day, an old woman gave her directions to the statue garden. "You'll find good company there," the woman said. "None of them are trying to impress anyone." Hannah went that Sunday. The air smelled of wet stone and pine needles. As she stepped through the broken gate, she felt her chest loosen. The world quieted. The path was overgrown in places, the earth soft under her shoes. She paused, for one statue just a head and shoulders, the face incomplete, one eye missing. And yet, something about it struck her. The softness of the unfinished curve. Suggestion of emotion without clarity. It reminded her of herself. She began visiting weekly, sitting on the mossy rocks with her sketchbook, not drawing the statues exactly, but drawing how they made her feel. Her lines became looser, more organic. The precision of her old design world began to dissolve. She stopped trying to finish anything. One day, she brought clay. She didn't plan it. She simply woke with the urge to touch the earth. There was an empty corner of the garden, overgrown, but spacious. She knelt there and began to sculpt. Slowly, without a plan, her hands moved without the permission of her mind. The shape she made was odd, a torso only, no face, one shoulder higher than the other. She didn't correct it, she left it there. She returned the next day, and the next. More shapes emerged. None perfect, all sincere. The villagers began to notice. "She's adding to the unfinished," they whispered. One afternoon, as Hannah was shaping a small seated figure, a man approached. He was in his 70s, with silver hair and hands stained with soil. "My grandfather carved the first statue here," he said. She looked up, startled. "I'm sorry if I'm disturbing it." He shook his head. "Not at all. We've waited a long time for someone to continue." "But you don't carve like he did." "I don't know how," she admitted. "That's why it works." He smiled. They sat together a while in silence. Then he said, "He never wanted to finish them, you know." She turned toward him. "I thought he died before he could." He nodded. "That's what people say. But I remember his words when I was a boy. He said, 'When I try to finish, I lose their soul. But when I stop just before I leave them room to become.'" Hannah's breath caught in her throat. That night, she lay awake beneath the sound of crickets and a distant river, thinking of all the things she had tried to finish, the perfect projects, the relationships she had sculpted in her mind but never truly lived. The image of herself she had so carefully carved for the world to admire, but none of it had breathed. It was all marble, unmovable, until now, the next morning. She returned to the garden with a different intention, not to shape something, but to sit beside what already was. She bowed to the old statues, touched the cracks with reverence, and in one figure missing its face, she saw more truth than in any completed bust she'd ever studied. Because it was unfinished, it was alive in Zen. Teaching, form is emptiness and emptiness is form. The perfection we chase is an illusion, a projection of a mind terrified of letting go. True beauty lies not in completion, but in presence, in what breathes through the gaps. In psychology, the fear of incompleteness often stems from shame. We rush to finish, to polish, to explain because we believe we are only worthy when we are whole. But healing begins when we learn to sit with what is partial, to hold the unfinished self with compassion. Hannah never tried to complete her statues. She let them emerge, pause, rest. The villagers began visiting the garden again, not to admire, but to reflect. They saw themselves in the tilted heads, the unformed hands, the pauses in clay. And somehow they felt less alone. Years later, when Hannah passed, they placed a small stone beside her favorite statue. No name, no dates. Just a line she once said to a child who had asked her why the figures had no eyes, so they can see who you really are. May you, too, one day walk among your own unfinished statues, and instead of judging back. Story 10. The bridge that was never built. The river ran wide and silent through the village of Matsura, like a ribbon of memory winding through the past. On one bank stood the homes and tea fields of the villagers. On the opposite bank, across from them, rose a thick forest where no one had lived for generations. Mist gathered above its trees in the early morning like unspoken thoughts hovering between what is and what could be. There was no bridge. There never had been, and yet, every year, for as long as anyone could remember, the villagers held a ceremony at the river's edge. They dressed in white, lit lanterns, placed them on the water, and watched as they floated toward the far shore. They did not speak during the ceremony. They only bowed when the lanterns vanished into mist. Akira, the youngest monk from the mountain temple nearby, had heard of the ceremony and asked one elder, a woman named Fumiko, why they did it. We honor what we've lost, she said, looking toward the forest. What was lost over there? She smiled without answering, then added, you're still young. You want to build bridges. One day, you'll see some rivers are crossed by standing still. Akira returned to the temple, puzzled. As a monk still in training, he often found himself caught between wanting to understand and being told to let go of the need. But the question lingered. Why would an entire village perform a ritual for a place they never visited? Years passed. Akira's head was shaved fully now. His robes no longer trailed with inexperience. He chanted more deeply, swept more slowly, asked fewer questions, but the memory of the lanterns and that wide, quiet river never left him. One spring, after a particularly harsh winter that had cracked many roofs and felled several old trees, Akira returned to Matsura to offer help with repairs. The villagers were grateful, but their faces were heavy with something deeper than fatigue. The floods, Fumiko explained, now older and slower, took some of the homes closest to the river. The earth has softened. Akira offered to walk with her to assess the damage. They followed the winding path to the river's edge. The water was higher now, more restless. The forest on the other side looked closer, though it was not. He asked again, do you know why there was never a bridge? Fumiko was quiet. Then she pointed to a stone marker half buried in moss. It was planned once. My grandfather helped lay that stone, the first of what was to be many. But the bridge was never finished. Why not? Because on the night before construction was to begin, the builder's son drowned in the river. He had wandered too close. The current took him. Akira bowed his head. After that, the builder refused to continue. He said the river had taken his future, and he would not give it more. Others tried to revive the plan, but every time something went wrong, an illness, a fire, another loss. Eventually, the village decided it was not meant to be crossed, and The ceremony, Fumiko smiled. It began as mourning. Then it became remembering. Now, it is simply a way of bowing to what we cannot change. Akira sat by the stone for a long time after she left. He listened to the river. It was not angry, not mournful, just there, moving, carrying leaves, carrying light. He thought about all the bridges he had tried to build in his own life between himself and others, between the past and what he thought should have happened. How many hours had he spent drafting plans in his heart for crossings that never came? That night, he returned to the village and joined the others in preparing for the ceremony. He lit his lantern with care. When it was time, he walked to the edge, whispered a prayer not for the dead, but for all things unresolved, and set his lantern on the water. As it drifted away, he didn't watch it reach the other side. He closed his eyes and stayed. In Buddhist practice, there is deep teaching in the art of non-doing, of not fixing, not crossing, of staying exactly where we are, and allowing reality to speak in its own language. Modern life teaches us that everything must be connected, resolved, mended. That closure is essential. But often, the deepest healing comes not from building bridges, but from standing at the edge and acknowledging that some things must remain on the far shore. In psychology, the desire for closure can become a source of suffering. We push for answers where there are none. We demand explanations for grief, for betrayal, for life itself. But when we sit with the unanswered, when we let the lantern drift without following, something inside us softens. Akira never returned to the stone to begin construction. He never tried to finish the bridge, but he came back every year, not to walk across, to kneel, to listen, to remember that some rivers are not meant to be passed, some pain is not meant to be solved, some love is not meant to be restored, it is meant to be honored, watched as it drifts slowly into mist, and released with the gentle faith that presence is more powerful than resolution, and that staying, truly staying with the ache of what was and the mystery of what is, may be the most sacred crossing of all. Story 11. 3 breaths before the storming, a quiet fishing village named Yura, where the sea met the land like an old friend, too familiar to flatter. People lived by the rhythm of tides. Boats came and went with the waves, and tempers often did the same. Life was not always soft. Their fish spoiled quickly, nets tore in storms, and tempers flared under sunburn and salt. At the edge of this village was a small weathered house where a man named Daiki lived. He was not a monk, nor did he speak of religion. He repaired nets, painted boats, and drank his tea with the slow care of someone who had once burned his tongue too many times. Children liked him, adults respected him, but few really knew him. What people remembered most about Daiki was that he never raised his voice. Not once. Not when boats came in damaged. Not when fishermen cursed over tangled ropes. Not even when a young boy had accidentally broken his garden, gate and run away in shame. Daiki had simply rebuilt the gate, whistling to himself, and placed a tiny paper crane on it the next morning. He's not normal, people whispered. He's hiding something, others said, but none could deny. The calm he carried like a second skin. One summer, just before the rainy season arrived, tensions in the village ran high. The fish weren't biting, the tides were erratic, and a long-standing disagreement between 2 brothers Kenji and Ryo erupted into public shouting near the docks. Their father had died recently, and the inheritance of a boat, and half-beloved, had become a source of deep bitterness. Kenji accused Ryo of stealing repairs money. Ryo shouted that Kenji only cared now that the boat might sail. The air buzzed with tension. Neighbors gathered, unsure whether to intervene or let them tire themselves out. Deki walked by just then, carrying a basket of dried herbs. He paused, then placed the basket down, walked between the two brothers, and stood silently. They shouted over him, ignoring his presence. Then he raised a hand not to stop them, just to breathe. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. No words, just 3 long breaths, slow and deliberate, his body unmoving in the middle of their storm. At first, the brothers continued to yell, but then something shifted. The rhythm of Daiki's breathing, the stillness of his eyes, the complete lack of reaction began to slow them down. Kenji stopped mid-sentence. Ryo blinked, his fists unclenching just slightly. Daiki bowed gently and walked away. He did not speak a word. That night rain came. Not a storm, just a steady rhythm, like someone drumming gently on the roof of the world. The next day, the brothers spoke. Not loudly, not warmly, but with space between their words. Enough space for something to begin again. Later, when asked what he had done, Daiki simply said, 3 breaths before the storm. In his small home, above his tea shelf, was a wooden plaque with 4 carved characters. Ikioshite, Mimamoru witness years ago. Daiki had not been so calm. He had served in the military as a young man, seen things no one should see, done things he never spoke of. His anger had once been fire-consuming, impulsive, without pause. One day, during a heated moment in his past life, he had struck a friend and broken his jaw. That friend had forgiven him, but Daiki had never forgiven himself. He left that life behind, came to Yura, and made a vow. He would never act on the first wave he would breathe. Always, he began each morning with 3 breaths by the sea. When villagers came to him angry, he offered them tea, not solutions. When storms came, he tied his nets calmly and told the waves, "Do what you must, I am here." In Zen teaching, the space between stimulus and response is where wisdom lives. The first feeling is not the problem, is the reaction to it that shapes our karma. Anger arises, sadness arises, fear arises. But when we meet them with breath, we reclaim the choice to respond, rather than explode. Modern psychology echoes this. The amygdala, seat of fight or flight, activates in milliseconds. But breath slow, deep, conscious activates the parasympathetic nervous system. It gives the thinking brain time to return, time to choose. Deki's wisdom was not in knowing the right answer. It was in waiting 3 breaths. That was all. Later that year, a larger storm came. A typhoon, stronger than most had seen in decades. Boats were tied. Homes shuddered. The village braced itself. Daiki stayed by the docks until the last minute, helping others secure their ropes. He did not rush. He checked each knot twice. Then, he returned home, brewed tea, and sat by the window. The storm screamed, shingles tore, trees bent, but Daiki did not move. He simply breathed. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. When dawn broke, damage lay scattered across the village. But Daiki's small house stood firm, as if the storm had bowed around it. He opened his door, poured a cup of tea, and watched the sea return to itself in time. The village came to adopt his rhythm, not all at once, but little by little. Children, were taught to pause before reacting. Couples breathed together before speaking hard truths. Even the most impatient fisherman began, tying knots with a little more care. The storm had come, but so had something else. A breath, a space, a choice. When Daki passed years later, villagers gathered by the sea. They lit lanterns, not for mourning, but for stillness. One child, barely old enough to speak clearly, asked why everyone was so quiet. Her mother knelt beside her. Because he taught us, she said, how to wait, how to breathe, and what happens after 3 breaths. The girl asked. The mother smiled. Then we speak from the heart, not the storm. May you too remember, before the next outburst, before the next decision, before the wave crashes, take 3 breaths, and let the storm pass without carrying you away. Story 12. The old lantern of Yamada, the far north of Japan. Nestled among steep cliffs and endless pines, there stood an ancient temple in Yamadera. It was built into the mountain itself, its wooden beams dark with age, its stone steps worn, smooth by pilgrims who had climbed in search of peace, answers, or silence. At night, the temple glowed faintly with the light of oil lanterns, flickering like fireflies caught between worlds. It was here that an old monk named Genshin kept watch. He was not famous. His teachings were not printed. His name was not chanted by students across the land. Genshin simply swept the temple grounds, trimmed the moss, rang the bell at dawn, and lit a single lantern each evening as the sun sank below the mountains. That lantern made of copper and soot-darkened glass hung outside the main gate. It had been there for over 100 years, and every night Genshin walked out with his flint and oil, refilled the basin, and struck a spark. Villagers in the valley below often looked up and saw the light and felt reassured. No matter how cold or long the night, the lantern always burned. They said, as long as the light is there, the mountain still remembers us. But no one really asked why the old monk did it. Not until a young man named Haruki arrived. He was 25, fresh from the city, burdened not by luggage, but by something heavier grief. His mother had died suddenly. No accident, no warning. A quiet aneurysm that took her while she was boiling water for tea. One moment breath, the next stillness. Haruki had been a promising architect. Tall buildings, bright awards, fast promotions. But after the funeral, he abandoned it all, left his apartment, cut his phone line, and took a train north, aimlessly, until he stepped off at a station with only 2 signs, one pointing toward the mountains, the other toward the sea. He chose the mountain, and so he arrived at Yamadera with nothing but a worn backpack and a hollow chest. Genshin welcomed him with a bow and 2 cups of warm barley tea. No questions, no philosophy, just tea. The young man asked to stay. The old monk nodded. For weeks, Haruki lived in silence. He helped carry firewood, drew water from the well, cleaned incense trays. The work gave his hands something to do, but his heart felt as though it had been buried beneath snow. One evening, he noticed Genshin lighting the lantern. The monk's back was bent with age, his fingers careful, his gaze soft. Why do you light it every night? Haruki asked, the words catching like dry leaves in his throat. Genshin didn't answer immediately. He placed the lantern's glass lid back over the flame, watched it catch, and stood in silence for several breaths. Then he said, so the lost ones can find their way. Haruki frowned. You mean the spirits? Genshin smiled, but didn't Elaborate. That night, Haruki lay awake in his narrow futon, listening to the wind scrape against the temple walls. He thought of the city skyline, his office, his mother's hands, the way she used to trace circles on his back when he couldn't. Sleep. Her scent green tea and old books. She was gone, utterly. But the lantern still burned, the next day. Haruki followed Genshin through his routine, watching more carefully than usual. The monk's movements were slow but deliberate. He didn't just light the lantern. He prepared it as if welcoming an honored guest. He cleaned the soot. He checked the oil with reverence. He lit it as if offering it to the wind. Days passed. Then a snowstorm came, fierce and sudden. The village below disappeared beneath white. Branches broke. Path up the mountain was no longer visible. Wind howled like old ghosts looking for forgotten. Names.genshin did not light the lantern that night. When Haruki asked why, the old monk said, "Because it would not be seen." The words disturbed him. If the lantern was meant to guide the lost, wasn't now when it mattered most? But Genshin did not explain. The storm lasted 2 more days. On the 3rd night, the winds finally relented and the sky cleared. Stars pierced. The dark velvet sky, sharp and cold. Haruki, moved by instinct or longing, went out alone with the oil and flint. He knelt before the lantern. He cleaned it, refilled it, and struck the spark. It took 3 tries, but the flame caught. He watched it flicker behind the glass, trembling but steady. The next morning, Genshin found him asleep by the gate, snow covering his knees. "You lit the lantern," the monk said gently. Haruki opened his eyes. "I didn't want the lost to be alone." Genshin nodded, the faintest glint in his eyes. Then he said, "That's when the light matters most. Not when it's seen, but when it's needed." Haruki began lighting the lantern every night. Winter passed. Spring came. The snow melted. With it, something inside Haruki softened. He began to draw again. At first, just sketches in the dirt. Then, in his notebook. But this time, not buildings. He drew people, faces, moments. His mother's tea, cup, Genshin's hands, the flicker of the lantern's flame. Years later, Haruki left the temple. He returned to the city, but not to the same life. He opened a studio, taught others, painted, built small homes with wide windows and places for lanterns. At the entrance to his studio, he placed a replica of the old copper lantern. He lit it. Each night, he told his students, "Not everything we make is meant to be seen, but someone, somewhere, may need the light." And once, during a blackout in the city, a passerby saw the small flame in his window. They paused, took a breath, and walked on with steadier steps. The old monk in Yamadera eventually passed, peacefully. One autumn night, with the lantern lit beside him, the temple remained. The lantern remained, and so did the ritual. Every evening, as the shadows stretched and the wind grew thin, a monk young or old would kneel before the copper frame, clean the soot, refill the oil, and strike the spark. Because somewhere, someone might be walking through the dark, and even if they never reached the mountain was still waiting, with light. Story 13. The Garden of Stone Zat, the edge of a quiet coastal village in southern Japan, stood a small, secluded monastery called Shigetsuan, which meant Hermitage of the Silent Moon. It was not a grand temple like those found in Kyoto or Nara. It had no gold statues or painted ceilings, no tourist paths or souvenir stalls. just a moss-covered gate, a gravel path, and a garden made entirely of stones. There were no flowers, no fountains, no fish ponds. Only stones-raked gravel, silent boulders, and arrangements of rocks so carefully placed they seemed to breathe. It was here that an elderly nun named Senzen lived in solitude. Her name meant Snow Mountain, and she had not spoken a word. In over 30 years, no one knew why. Some said she had taken a vow of silence in her youth. Others whispered she had once been a great teacher, but after a tragic loss had retreated from the world. What was known was that she kept the garden with meticulous care. Every morning before sunrise, she raked the gravel into ripples that resembled wind on water. She washed the stones with a cloth dipped in the spring near the cliff. She moved, 1 pebble, 1 inch, with the patience of someone tending to the breath of the earth. Once a week, villagers left offerings at the gate, fresh fruit, rice, sometimes wildflowers picked by children. And once a season, Senzen would leave a single haiku written on mulberry paper pinned to the bamboo gate. The poems were always short, always wordless in a way that pierced deeper than explanation. One spring morning, a girl arrived at the monastery. She was no more than 16. Her hair was tied in a rough braid, her eyes sunken with sleeplessness, her clothes damp from the road. She said her name was Ayame.Senzan, opened the gate without a word. Am bowed deeply and stood for a long moment in the threshold, as if unsure whether she was entering a sacred space or fleeing from something broken. Senzen simply turned and walked inside, the silent invitation clear. The girl followed. In the weeks that passed, Ayam did not speak much either. But in the silence, something subtle began to unfold. She swept the wooden floorboards. She cooked simple meals, barley soup, pickled plums, grilled eggplant. She fetched water. And most of all, she watched the garden. At first, she couldn't understand it. Why spend so much time arranging rocks? They did not bloom. They did not die. They were not alive. But slowly, she began to notice. The shadow of a rock changed with the sun's arc. The raked lines shifted with the wind. The space between stones was just as meaningful as the stones themselves. Sometimes Senzen would sit for hours before moving a single pebble half an inch to the left. There was no rush, no applause, only the rhythm of breath and presence. One evening, Ayam found herself sitting in front of the garden long after Senzen had retired. The moonlight cast pale silver across the gravel, making the stones seem as if they floated on clouds. She began to cry, soft at first. Then, uncontrollably, the weight she had carried for so long spilled from her like water breaching a dam. Her father had died the previous winter. He had fallen from the cliffs while fishing, and his body was never found. She had waited for weeks, sitting by the sea each morning, watching for anything to return. A jacket, a shoe, even a bone. But nothing came back. Her mother had collapsed into grief, barely able to speak, and Ayam had been left alone to carry both her sorrow and her mother's silence. The village had grown cold, the sea indifferent, and even the sky seemed to mourn in grey dot. So she had walked, and now here she was, weeping in a garden of stones. She thought Senzen was asleep, but the next morning she found something pinned to the bamboo post where haiku were sometimes left. It read, "Does the sea return? No, but the waves kiss the shore again and again." Ayam folded the paper and pressed it to her chest. She began to speak that day, not much, just a few words. To herself, to the wind, to the rocks. And strangely, she began to hear things, too. Not voices, not messages, but the sound of what was not said, the wind brushing past the stones, the silence between birdsong, the hush of gravel under rake, a sound so soft it could only be heard by someone who had been truly quiet inside. One afternoon, Ayam asked Senzen, "Do you ever wish to speak again?" Senzen looked up from her work, her face wrinkled like mountain ridges on an old map. Her eyes were clear, not clouded by age, but washed by time. She smiled and wrote on a slate, "Words are not forbidden. I am simply listening longer." Ia sat down beside her and picked up a rake. "I'd like to listen too." They worked in silence. Years passed, seasons turned. Ayam grew, her hands became strong from gardening, her eyes steady from watching the moon, the sea, the wind. She learned how to cook with what the earth gave. She learned that grief does not vanish, but it changes shape. Like a stone polished by time, it loses its sharpest edges. One day, a traveler arrived. He asked for Senzen, but Ayam met him at the gate. Senzen had passed away quietly in her sleep that spring. The garden was as still as ever. The traveler bowed and asked if he might leave an offering. Ayam accepted it with both hands. Rice cakes and a slip of paper. Then she turned and walked back to the garden. The traveler stood by the gate, expecting her to return, to speak, to explain, but she did not. Instead, he watched as she knelt by the stones, adjusted a small pebble near a moss patch, and began to rake the gravel in slow rhythmic spirals. No words, no instructions, only presence. When he left, he told the villagers, "There is a new gardener at Sigitsuan." They nodded. A few weeks later, a haiku appeared at the gate. It read, "A stone never blooms, yet spring lives within its stillness. So too, my silence." And so the garden continued. The stones remained. The wind spoke. And Ayam, once a girl running from the sea, now stood rooted as deeply as the mountain behind. Her dot, she was the gardener of silence. She no longer needed to be found. She had become the garden itself. Story 14. The boy who painted time in a remote valley where the sky met the mountains with no cities in sight. There lived a boy named Taro who painted with ink that never faded. He lived alone in a thatched cottage near the forest edge, in a place where time seemed to move slowly, as if the mountains themselves watched every minute pass with deliberate care. Taro had been found as a child wandering near the waterfall, barefoot, speechless, and holding nothing but a broken brush. The monks from the nearby temple took him in, but he never spoke a word. He didn't need to. His eyes told stories, and his hands painted them. By the age of 12, he had already painted things that puzzled even the most learned scholars' visions of temples that no longer existed, portraits of ancestors no one remembered, and landscapes of places no one had ever seen but felt they knew. His brush seemed to capture more than what was visible. It painted emotions, echoes, and time itself. The villagers began to visit him in the hopes he might paint their pasts or futures. Taro did not charge for his work. He only painted what came to him in silence. If someone asked, "Can you paint my grandmother?" he would close his eyes, listen to the wind, and either pick up the brush or walk away. He answered to something beyond language. One day, a girl named Kana arrived. She was not from the valley. Her accent was softer, her hands calloused from weaving silk, and her eyes carried a storm beneath their calm surface. She did not bow or speak many pleasantries. She simply placed a folded paper on Taro's table. Inside was a drawing of her family shrine, torn, smudged, burned on one edge. "I want to remember what was lost," she said. "Can you help?" Taro studied the paper. Then he turned and picked up a fresh sheet. With slow, deliberate movements, he began to draw. It took 3 days. During that time, neither of them spoke. Kana cooked rice and gathered water from the spring. Taro painted, his brow furrowed not with effort but with listening, as if the paper itself whispered to him. When the final stroke dried, he handed the painting to Kana. She gasped. It was the shrine, but not as it had been. It was older, more vibrant. Not the ruined memory she carried, but a vision of it as it might have once stood, alive with candles, prayer flags swaying in the breeze. The scent of sandalwood in the air, even the tiny paw prints of a cat long past scrawled at the wooden step. Kana began to cry. "This isn't how it looked," she said, "but it's how I feel it." Taro nodded. The next morning, she left, but every month she returned. Not for another painting, but to sit and watch him work. Others came to people with questions they could not speak aloud. Taro painted not what they wanted, but what they needed. Sometimes it was an image of a childhood toy, other times the last sunset a loved one had seen. One man asked for a picture of his lost son, but Taro painted a tree the boy had once climbed. The man wept harder than he ever had. Then came the emperor's men. Word had spread beyond the mountains. Stories of the boy who could paint memories and time had reached the capital. A retainer in lacquered armor stood before Taro's door, flanked by soldiers in blue. "The emperor requests your service," he said. Taro did not respond. "He wishes to see your art. In person, you will be treated as an honored guest." Kana stood nearby, watching with unease. Taro stared at the inkstone in his hand. The brush trembled slightly. "Will you come willingly?" the retainer asked. Taro dipped his brush and painted a single image on the wall. It was a bird in a cage, the door open, the bird still inside. The retainer frowned. "I will return in 3 days." When they left, Kana asked, "Why not go? You could be safe, respected, have better tools, a bigger studio." Taro looked at the bird again. "I'm not afraid," Kana said, "but I don't want you to disappear." That night, a storm rolled in. The wind tore through the trees. Rain lashed the roof. Taro sat by candlelight, painting with calm precision. When morning came, the painting lay finished. It showed the same mountains, the same valley but empty. No people, no homes, only wind and stone. Kana stared at it, then turned to him. "You're leaving." Taro looked down. He handed her a sealed scroll. "For you," he whispered. His voice was soft and dry from disuse. Kana blinked. It was the first and only word she ever heard from him. That day, when the emperor's men returned, Taro walked with them. Years passed. No one saw him again, but strange things began to happen. People who visited the palace in the capital spoke of a hidden chamber with no doors. Inside, paintings covered every inch of the walls, paintings that changed when no one was looking. A sunrise would darken into dusk. A child would grow old in the portrait. A mountain would crumble slowly over months. Some said the boy had painted time so well that his art had become time itself. Back in the valley, Kana remained. She opened the scroll he had left only once. Inside was a painting of herself older, her hair streaked with grey, standing before a cottage with a child by her side. She folded it back and placed it in a wooden box. She never married, but one day a girl arrived, lost quiet, holding a broken brush, Kana opened the door and smiled. "You must be hungry," she said. And so the rhythm continued. Time, after all, was never straight. It curved, returned, unfolded like a scroll in the hands of one who knew how to read the silences. Between the strokes. Story 15. The silence beneath the Berlin, the highlands of central Japan, where mist covered the hills like a white shawl each morning, there stood a small temple perched on a craggy slope. The temple was not known for its grandeur, nor for the number of monks it housed, but for a single, peculiar bell. It had no rope, no clapper, and no sound. For nearly a century it had remained mute. Locals called it the Silent Bell. Some said it was cursed. Others believed it was sacred. But none truly understood why it was there or what it meant, only that when one sat before it long enough, something deep within would begin to stir. The temple's abbot, Master Schwen, was a gentle, aging man with eyes like worn stones and a voice barely above a whisper. He rarely left the temple grounds, spending his days tending to the moss gardens and tea herbs, and his nights beside the bell in meditation. One spring morning, as the cherry blossoms bloomed and scattered there, petals like fragments of forgotten thoughts, a young man arrived at the temple. He wore city clothes, his shoes still covered in the dust of the train station far below, and his face was drawn with sleepless nights. He bowed awkwardly to Master Schwinn and spoke with a polite but urgent tone. "I heard you have a bell that does not ring." The old monk looked at him and gave a small smile. "Many things do not ring," he said, "but that doesn't mean they are silent." The young man introduced himself as Riku. He was a philosophy student from Tokyo, but his visit was not for research. He had come seeking answers he couldn't find in books or lectures, in coffee shops or libraries. "My mother passed 3 months ago," he said later, sitting under the eaves with Master Schwen. "She died in her sleep without saying goodbye. Since then, I haven't been able to feel anything. People talk about grief like it should crush you, make you cry or scream. But I feel nothing, just an endless ringing in my ears, a dull hum." Master Schwen nodded and motioned for him to follow. They walked through the moss garden, where dew clung to every leaf and stone like ancient tears. At the center of a circular clearing stood the Beltal bronze, beautifully carved with swirling clouds and lotus petals. Riku stood before it, waiting. "Should I try to strike it?" he asked. "There is no clapper," the monk replied. "It cannot be struck, nor does it respond to force." Riku tilted his head. "Then what is it for? To hear what cannot be heard." That evening, the monk showed him to a small room with tatami mats, a straw pillow, and a blanket that smelled of cedar and old prayers. Before sleeping, Riku asked, "Have you ever heard the bell?" Master Schwen smiled and said, "When I stopped waiting for it, Next morning, Riku sat before the bell. The birds sang in the distance. The wind moved gently through the trees. The bell stood motionless, a quiet sentinel. He closed his eyes and waited for the first hour. His thoughts screamed off City's emails, arguments with his father. The moment he got the phone call about his mother, the uncomfortable silence at the funeral, the way the incense at the altar made him gag. The second hour, he grew restless. His legs ached. His back protested. His mind begged for distraction. By the third hour, something shifted. He no longer listened for sound. He listened for stillness. Each morning he returned to the bell. Each evening he left with nothing. Or so he thought. One day a storm came. Rain lashed the temple roof. Trees groaned under the wind. Lightning danced on the far peaks. Yet Riku sat by the bell, soaked, unflinching. It was the first time he didn't flinch from the cold or the fear of being alone. That night, as he dried himself by the fire, Master Shuen poured him a cup of warm tea. "Why stay?" the monk asked gently. "Most who come leave after a day or two." "I don't know," Riku said. I keep hoping it'll ring. Not just the bell, but something in me." The monk nodded. "It may not ring," he said, "but it may echo." Another week passed. Then one morning, as cherry blossoms began to fall like soft confetti, Riku sat in his usual place, staring at the bell. He was not thinking, he was not waiting. He simply breathed, and in that breath he felt it. Not a sound, not a vibration, but a shift. Something deep inside, like a thread, being plucked at the center of his being. He opened his eyes. The bell remained still, yet his chest felt warm. His eyes, suddenly wet. Tears slid down his face before he realized they had come. Not from grief, not from pain, but from the simple recognition that he had been holding something tightly, and now it was dissolving. He wept until the sun rose. Fully, when he returned to the temple hall, Master Shuen was tending to a bonsai. "I think I heard it," Riku whispered. The monk didn't turn. He only said, "Then you are finally listening." That afternoon, Riku walked alone into the nearby forest. He sat beside a quiet stream, his reflection broken by ripples. He remembered his mother's laughter, not a specific moment, but the texture of it, the way it filled the room, the way it once made him feel seen. He didn't try to chase the memory. He let it come and go like clouds across the sky. When he returned to Tokyo, he left behind his camera, his notebook, and his expectations. What he brought back could not be written down. In time, he became a professor not of philosophy, but of silence. He led small retreats, teaching students not how to think, but how to stop thinking, how to listen to what speaks without voice. He never mentioned the bell, but he kept a small painting of it above his desk. And some nights, when the city's hum quieted and his heart remembered the valley's breath, he would sit in his apartment, close his eyes, and feel the silence beneath the sound. Somewhere deep inside, the bell still stood, and it was still ringing. Story 16. The Lantern That Forgot Its Lighting. A secluded village nestled between the foothills of the eastern mountains. There lived a woman named Hane, who had long been known as the Lantern Maker's daughter. The title followed her like a shadow, even though her father had passed away many years before, and the lantern workshop had not been lit for nearly a decade. Hane was not young, nor was she yet old. Her face held the softness of youth and the weariness of loss in equal measure. Since her father's death, she had kept the workshop closed, the paper windows shuttered, the tools untouched. She worked at the village tea house instead, where she poured warm censure for weary farmers and monks returning from pilgrimage. No one asked about the lanterns anymore. No one expected the light to return. But each night, before sleep, Hane would sit on the wooden steps outside her quiet house and look at the sky. She didn't search for stars. She waited for the ache in her chest to soften, for the grief. Stop whispering. But it never did. One autumn evening, a stranger arrived in the village. He was a boy of about 13, dressed in travel-worn robes and carrying a cloth sack slung over one shoulder. His hair was short and unkempt, his feet calloused. But his eyes held a calm far beyond his years. He came into the tea house just before sunset, when the golden light slanted low through the shoshi screens. Hane served him tea, and he bowed with grace. He introduced himself only as Ren. "You've come a long way," she said, noticing the dust on his sleeves. He nodded. "I am looking for a lantern," he said simply. Her hands paused. "We don't sell them anymore." "I know," Ren replied, "but I was told there was one here that forgot its light. I want to help it remember." She gave a faint smile, unsure whether to laugh or dismiss the boy's strange words. But something in his presence, quiet, patient, persistent, unsettled her. That night, he waited outside her house. "I can't help you," she said from behind the door. "I'm not asking for help," he said. "Only to sit where the lanterns used to be made." She said nothing more and left the door closed. But the next morning, she found him sitting in front of the workshop, silent, unmoving, as if keeping vigil for something long lost. For 3 days, he returned. He did not knock. He did not call her name. He only sat before the old wooden doors, eyes closed, back straight, as if meditating on the dust. On the 4th day, she opened the doors. The workshop was as it had always been, dim, hollow, and cold. With memories, spiderwebs clung to corners. Dust blanketed the workbench. Paper patterns had curled at the edges. Her father's chisel lay exactly where he had left it. Ren stepped inside without speaking, his gaze moving gently across the room. "This place remembers," he said softly. She didn't know what he meant. Perhaps he was mad, or perhaps she was for letting him in. They didn't speak much that day. He asked to help clean. She allowed it. Together, they swept the floor and folded the old washi paper. They cleared the workbench and opened a window each. Day after that, Ren returned. He asked nothing in return. And slowly, like ice thawing in spring, the workshop began to breathe again. One afternoon, he asked if he could try making a lantern. "You've never made one before," she said. He shook his head. "But I've seen the patterns in dreams." She watched as his hands moved carefully, cutting and folding the paper with a reverence that bordered on prayer. His first attempt was crooked. The frame wobbled, but he did not complain. He started. Again, by the 5th lantern, something delicate emerged, slightly uneven, but full of heart. She found herself reaching for her father's brush, dipping it into ink, and tracing clouds along the paper with her old steadiness. As days became weeks, villagers began to take notice. One night, someone passing by saw a soft glow from within. The workshop, word spread. Then, during the Festival of Lights, the mayor came to her. "Will you make lanterns this year?" he asked. "It's been too long since we saw them float across the river." She hesitated. "I'm not my father," she said. "But the light," he said gently, "still carries his name." That evening, Hane stood alone before the workshop. She remembered her father's hands guiding hers. She remembered the warmth of freshly lit lanterns, the way their glow touched people's faces. She remembered the year he died, how the lanterns had gone unlit, how the village had dimmed. She returned to the workbench. For the next several days, she and Ren worked together. Dozens of lanterns, red, white, gold, sprouted from their fingers. Each one unique, each one infused with something beyond paper, and would dot the festival came. That night, villagers gathered at the riverbank. Children laughed, elders clapped, musicians played old melodies. Hane lit the first lantern, her hands trembling. It drifted gently across the dark water, casting golden ripples. Then another followed. and another dot soon. The river was alive with light. She stood beside Ren, watching them go. For the first time in years, she felt no ache, no weight on her chest. Only warmth. "You reminded me," she said quietly. Ren smiled but said nothing. The next morning, he was gone. He had left no note, no message, only a single lantern on the workshop bench. It was unlike any other. Its paper bore no ink. Its wood was unmarked. But when she lit it that night, the flame glowed soft blue, like the color of the sky just before dawn. She placed it on the highest shelf, above her father's tools, where it would never be sold. Years passed, the lantern shop reopened. It never became a place of commerce, only of healing. People came not just for light, but for silence, for memory, for something unnamed they had long forgotten. And sometimes, when she sat alone at dusk, Hane would look at the blue lantern, wonder who was the boy, a lost pilgrim, a monk in disguise, or perhaps just a quiet reminder that even the forgotten have their time to shine again in the end. It didn't matter. The light had returned, and so had she. Story 17. The man who planted silence in the midst of a dense forest in the northern highlands, where the mist hung low like ancient breath and birds spoke in hushed tones. There lived an old man named Shoji. He was not known by many. The villagers at the edge of the forest referred to him simply as the Quiet One. Few had ever seen him clearly, and fewer still had spoken with him. But they all knew of his presence, like one knows the presence of wind without ever seeing it. Shoji lived in a modest wooden hut, roofed with moss and shaded by tall cedar trees. His days were simple. He rose before dawn, tended to the forest paths, drew water from the mountain spring, and disappeared into the trees with a satchel on his back. No one knew what he did in the forest. Some said he gathered herbs. Others believed he spoke to spirits. Children imagined him as a wandering monk who had once been a warrior in truth. Shoji spent each morning planting silence. He carried in his satchel not seeds, but stones smooth, dark, and cold. These were not ordinary stones. Each one had been gathered from the mouth of the mountain where the winds screamed loudest, where thunder once split the earth during a great storm many years ago. Shoji believed that those stones remembered sound, and when placed with intention, they absorbed noise like a sponge draws in water. He would dig shallow holes along hidden paths, beneath trees where birds argued, beside streams that gossiped, with pebbles, and place the stones carefully, like offerings. Then he would sit beside them, eyes closed, palms open, and breathe. He believed that silence, true silence, was not the absence of sound, but the presence of peace. His life was uneventful. But something began to shift one winter when a woman arrived in the village at the forest's edge. Her name was Aiko. She had come from the city with her young son, seeking escape from a noise she could no longer bear. The city had grown too. Loud horns, sirens, shouts, the endless buzz of machines and opinions. Her husband, once gentle, had become a man of anger. One night, the shouting had cracked the boy's heart like porcelain. They left the next morning, Aiko, rented a small house in the village, and tried to find silence. But the village, though quieter than the city, still held noise. Dogs barking, neighbors talking, the creak of roofs in the wind. Her son Kenta spoke little and stared often. His laughter, once bright as summer bells, had vanished. One day, she heard the villagers speak of the Quiet One. They say he never speaks. An old woman said, "They say he carries silence in his pocket," added another. Aiko was desperate. She asked where to find him. The villagers only shrugged. "He finds you," someone said. So she waited, and weeks passed. Then, one foggy morning, as she walked with Kenta, near the edge of the forest, she noticed a figure seated beneath an old cedar, motionless as a statue. It was Shoji. He did not look at them. He did not speak. But something about his stillness made Kenta pause. The boy stepped toward him, cautiously, and sat down beside him. Shoji did not react. Kenta sat for a long time, and Aiko, unsure, waited nearby. When the boy finally returned to her side, he said nothing. But that night, he slept without crying. The next day, they returned. Shoji was in the same place. Again, Kenta sat beside him. Again, they did not speak. Aiko watched from a distance, heart trembling. Days turned into weeks. Shoji never said a word. But each time the boy came, he handed him a smooth stone. Kenta would accept it solemnly and hold it tightly on the walk home. One day, Kenta spoke for the first time in months. He says the stones are not for throwing, they are for planting. Ico's eyes filled with tears. Each day, they went deeper. Into the forest, Kenta following Shoshi's slow, deliberate steps. Aiko followed behind. They reached places no one in the village knew, silent glades where the wind bent low to listen. Clearings where even the birds did not sing. In these places, Shoji would hand Kenta a stone and nod toward the earth. The boy would dig a small hole, place the stone, and cover it gently with moss or leaves. He says the earth remembers, Kenta told her once. Shoshi's silence became the boy's sanctuary, and slowly, like morning mist rising from the river, Kenta's voice returned. He spoke sparingly, with care, as if relearning a forgotten language. He laughed once, startling a deer, and Aiko, too, felt something shifting within her. She began to walk barefoot along the forest paths, feeling the earth beneath her soles. Her breath slowed. Her shoulders dropped. The noise inside her chest, the fear, the guilt, the grief began to soften. One evening, she gathered the courage to speak to Shoji. "Why do you do this?" she asked. He turned to her, eyes deep and gentle. "To remind the world," he said. Voice raspy with disuse. That silence still grows. It was the only time he spoke. That winter, Shoji did not return from one of his walks. The villagers searched for him, but found nothing. No footprints, no trail, no belongings. Only a single stone placed carefully at the center of the village square. Aiko and Kenta continued their walks. They followed the trails he had shown them, planting stones in quiet places. Others began to join children, elders, strangers who came to the village with restless hearts. The forest paths became places of pilgrimage. Years passed. The village changed. It grew more peaceful, not through decree or discipline, but through remembrance. People paused before speaking. They listened. Longer, they walked slower. Kenta grew tall and kind. He became known as the boy who planted silence. He never forgot Shoji, nor did Aiko, and sometimes, deep in the forest, when the fog rolled low and the trees stood still, she would feel it a stillness that was more than absence, a presence, a breath. Shoji had not disappeared. He had simply become what he had always tended. Silence, real silence, not empty, not void, but full, alive, rooted in the earth. Story 18. The echo of empty cups. There was a village cradled between the hills and the river. so small that it did not appear on most maps. Life there moved with the rhythm of the seasons, measured not in hours but in the color of leaves and the height of the river. In this village, everyone knew one another by name, and every story traveled like wind, sometimes gentle, sometimes biting. At the heart of the village stood a tea house. It was old, its wooden beams dark with time, the roof lined with moss, and wind chimes hanging beneath the eaves that sang soft, hollow melodies. The tea house had no name. People simply called it the place by the river, and the woman who ran it was known only as Hannah. Hannah was in her 70s, but her back was straight, her eyes clear, and her hands moved with the grace of someone who had spent a lifetime pouring tea with intention. She spoke little, smiled often, and served tea to anyone who entered, whether they were strangers or childhood friends. What made her tea special was not the leaves she used. It was the silence she served it with. The villagers believed Hannah's tea could mend a broken heart, calm an angry mind, or bring clarity to confused thoughts. People came to her not just for warmth, but for something they couldn't name, something between peace and remembering. It was said that if you drank from one of her empty cups, you would hear your own soul speak. No one knew what that meant exactly. Yet they came. One autumn afternoon, a man arrived in the village on foot, carrying nothing but a faded backpack and the weariness of a man who had forgotten how to rest. His name was Naoki, though he hadn't said it aloud in weeks. He was a teacher once, a husband once, a father once. Now, he was simply a man searching for a place where the noise inside him might finally stop. Villagers watched him from behind woven curtains and under conical hats. They whispered quietly, as villagers often do, but no one approached him. It was not distrust. It was an old courtesy. Some wounds speak more clearly in silence. Naoki found the tea house by chance. Or, perhaps, like most things that matter, it found him. He stepped inside as the sun was leaning low, casting gold over the wooden floor. The air smelled of roasted barley and pine. Wind chimes whispered above the doorway. Hannah was there, seated behind a low counter, her hands folded, as if she had been waiting. Naoki said nothing. She nodded gently, stood, and walked to a shelf where porcelain cups rested like sleeping birds. She selected one, blue-rimmed with a crack running through its center, and filled it with hot tea from a kettle that never seemed to whistle. She placed the cup before him and sat down across the table, still. No words were spoken. Naoki cupped the tea in both hands. It was warm but not scalding. He lifted it to his lips and drank. It tasted like memory. Not one specific moment, but the quiet before a storm. The feeling of your mother's hand on your forehead. The silence of snow at night. He placed the cup down. Hannah did not ask any questions, but something inside him shifted. He returned the next day, and the next, each day. Hannah chose a different cup. Some were perfect, others were chipped. A few were almost translucent. But each one carried a different silence, a different echo. Naoki began to notice things. How the sound of the tea pouring was different in each cup. How the steam curled like script he almost recognized. How the silence between sips had a shape. He did not talk about his past. He did not speak of his wife, who had died suddenly of an illness the doctors had no name for. He did not mention his daughter, whom he could no longer look at without drowning. In guilt, he simply drank, and in drinking, he remembered how to breathe again. One evening, after the first frost had silvered the garden outside, he finally spoke. I used to believe I had to carry everything alone, he said. Hana looked at him, her expression unchanged, but her eyes softened. Even the mountain lets the snow melt, she replied. He nodded. The tears that welled in his eyes did not fall. Later that night, Naoki stood by the river behind the tea house. The moonlight shimmered on the surface, broken by the slow drift of fallen leaves. He closed his eyes and for the first time in years, did not feel afraid of what he might hear in the silence. He began to help Hana in small ways, gathering firewood, sweeping the steps, fixing a broken hinge on a cabinet. She never asked for help, but she never refused it either. The villagers noticed the change in him. The lines on his face softened. The way he moved, no longer heavy with sorrow. The children began to wave to him. The elders nodded respectfully. One winter morning, a traveler came into the villager woman named Machiko, wrapped in a dark scarf, her eyes red from wind or weeping, perhaps both. She asked about the tea, Ahouse. Naoki was the one who pointed the way. He watched from across the garden as she entered. Watched as Hana selected a cup with a faded crane painted at the bottom. Watched as Michiko drank and her shoulders sank just, slightly, like someone lowering a heavy bag. He understood then. The tea house was not a place to forget pain. It was a place to remember that pain could become part of something quiet and beautiful, like a crack in porcelain, glazed over but not erased. Years passed. Naoki stayed. He learned the names of all the cups. He began choosing them himself, pouring tea for visitors when Hana was tired or out walking. He learned the art of silence, not as emptiness, but as offering. Then, one spring morning, Hana did not wake. There was no struggle, no sign of pain. Her hands were folded, her face calm, as if she had simply poured her last cup. The village mourned in the way she would have wanted quietly, with incense and wind chimes and bowls of tea left on doorsteps. Naoki cleaned the tea house. He sat in the same place she always had. And when the next visitor arrived, lost and silent, he did as Hana once did. He chose a cup. He poured the tea. And in the silence that followed, the healing began again. Outside, the river moved gently. The wind carried the scent of pine, and from the rafters of the old tea house, the wind chimes sang, soft and hollow, like the echo of empty cups filled once more with peace. Story 19. The Well Beneath the Stone Inn, a remote valley carved by wind and rain. There was a monastery hidden behind layers of cedar forests and mist. Few travelers came that far, for the path was steep and treacherous, winding through cliffs and moss-covered stones, often lost to fog or snowfall. But those who arrived, often weary in body and heavier still in heart, found not merely shelter, but something else, something they did not know they had been searching for. The monastery was called Chasakian, the House of Still Stones. Monks who lived there were few, no more than 10 in any season. They did not seek converts, nor did they preach. They tended the garden, studied the sutras, prepared simple meals, and maintained the ancient well at the center of the courtyard. It was said that the well held no water, only silence, and that if one gazed into it long enough, they would hear the sound of their own becoming. This story begins with a man named Kenji. Kenji was not a monk, nor was he a pilgrim. He was a stonemason from a bustling city far to the south, where noise never ceased and shadows came more from buildings than from trees. He had once been known for his skill in carving monuments, headstones, memorials, always working in the service of remembrance, though he himself tried to forget. A decade ago, Kenji had lost his wife in a fire that consumed their home and his heart. In the years since, he had buried himself in work, chiseling granite as if each strike could erase grief. But grief is not stone. It is wind. It enters through, cracks and lingers in silence. One winter, after completing a commission in the mountains, Kenji took a detour without quite knowing why. The map was old, the road uncertain, but something inside him stirred when he heard a woodcutter mention Chasaki in traveled by foot, sleeping under trees, waking to frost, following a path that grew narrower with each step. When he arrived, he did not knock. He stood at the gate with numb fingers and eyes that had not truly rested in years. A monk noticed him and, without a word, opened the door. Inside the monastery, time slowed. No one asked his name. No one asked why he had come. They gave him food, a place to sleep, and silence. He stayed. At first, he tried to help. He mended a broken step, repaired a crumbling wall, patched a cracked bowl. The monks nodded but said nothing. Days passed, then weeks. He began to wake with the sun, sweep the courtyard, and sit during morning zazen. Though his legs ached and his breath trembled, in the center of the courtyard stood the well. It was covered with a round stone slab, weathered smooth by centuries of hands and rain. No one spoke of it, but Kenji was drawn to it, as if the silence beneath called to something buried in him. One dusk, after the bell for evening meditation had faded, Kenji approached the well. He placed both hands on the stone and closed his eyes. The cold seeped through his skin into his bones. He whispered, "What is left when all is burned?" There was no reply, only wind. But that night he dreamed of Fire Knot, the one that took his wife, but an ancient flame burning in a cave, casting shadows of monks and beasts, of silence and sorrow flickering endlessly. When he awoke, tears clung to his lashes. Next morning, an elder monk named Eshin approached him in the garden. "You have hands that know how to shape stone," the monk said. Kenji nodded. "There is a task," Eshin continued, "but you must wait until the stone speaks to you." Kenji did not understand, but he bowed. Weeks passed. The snow melted. Crocuses began to bloom. Kenji carved nothing. He swept, meditated, cooked rice, and stared at the covered well. Then one morning, as mist curled like smoke over the mountain ridge, he knew. He walked to the well, laid both palms on the stone cover, and felt it thrum not with sound, but with presence. Eshin was already beside him, as if waiting. "It is time," the monk said. Together, they removed the cover. What lay beneath was not darkness, but stillness. The well held no water, only layers of stone and dust descending into unknown depth. "We do not dig for answers," Eshin said. "We carve to remember what was always here." Kenji descended with rope and lantern. He began clearing the walls, smoothing ancient surfaces, revealing faded carvings, mandalas, sutras, spirals of symbols lost to time. He worked in silence. Each strike of his chisel was a breath, each curve a prayer. As he carved, memories rose not in torment, but like petals. He remembered her laugh, the way she folded laundry with quiet joy. How she once said the world was not broken, only misunderstood. The well became a mirror when he surfaced. Days later, the monks received him with warm tea, but no words. They knew that spring, a new stone altar was erected beside the well, carved with a single character, Shin, meaning heart-mind. Not the heart of love or sorrow alone, but the heart that holds all things, the one that remains when the fire is gone and silence returns. Travelers continued to arrive. Some stayed a day, others a season. When they asked about the well, the monks would simply smile, and Kenji, he remained. He became the silent steward of the well, the one who repaired the steps, carved names in memory, taught newcomers how to listen to stone. He never called himself a monk, but he lived as one. One evening, many years later, a young woman arrived with tired eyes and a notebook filled with half-written poems. She stood at the well, unsure. Kenji walked beside her and said, "Place your hands here." "Wait, listen," she did. "What will I hear?" she asked. He looked into the fading sky, where stars began to appear like forgotten truths. "Only what's already inside you," he said. And as she closed her eyes and the night deepened, the wind moved through cedar and stone alike, carrying the echo of a silence older than grief, deeper than fire, and more enduring than words. Story 20. The Brush and the Windin, a modest town nestled between rice fields and quiet hills. There lived an old man named Akira, who was known not for his voice, but for his silence. He had once been a calligrapher of great renown in the city, where noble families and government officials commissioned his sweeping, elegant characters for scrolls, signage, and ancestral shrines. His brush carried a rare vitality, as if the ink itself were breathing. But one day, without warning or farewell, he disappeared from the public world and returned to his childhood village, where he lived alone in a humble cottage with no signs, no adornments, and no guests. Children whispered rumors that he had lost his mind. Some said he had gone blind and could no longer write. Others claimed he had been cursed. But in truth, Akira's hands remained steady, his eyes sharp. It was his heart that had grown still. Every morning, he walked to the edge of the fields and sat beneath a twisted pine, gazing into the distance. He brought with him a small wooden box inside, brushes wrapped in linen, inkstones, a flask of spring water, and folded sheets of blank rice paper, yet he never wrote. He sat, watched the wind, listened to the crows, and then returned home. Villagers, respectful of his age and mystery, left him be. But there was one child who could not. Her name was Yui. She was 11, with hair like crow feathers and eyes full of defiance. She lived with her grandfather, the village carpenter, and spent her days racing the wind, climbing trees, and drawing strange shapes in the dirt with sticks. She was always in motion except when watching Akira. At first, she watched from afar. Then she moved closer, then closer still, until one morning she approached and asked, "Why don't you paint anymore?" Akira didn't turn his head. He simply replied, "The wind no longer speaks." Yui furrowed her brow. "That's silly. The wind is always talking. You're just not listening right." Akira looked at her then, his face like a mountain softened by rain. "Perhaps," he said. The next morning she returned, and the next. Each time she brought a question. "Why do your brushes sleep in a box? Why don't you paint me something fierce, like a tiger? Did your ink dry up?" Akira answered gently, never irritated. "My brushes are resting. Tigers belong to the mountains, and ink never truly dries, it waits." One day, after weeks of quiet companionship, Yui did not speak. She sat beside him in silence, legs crossed, watching the wind stir the grass. Finally, she said, "I had a mother who sang." To me, Akira nodded. "She died 3 years ago. I still hear her song when I dream, But when I wake up, it's gone. I tried drawing it once, but it didn't look like anything, just lines. Lines can carry sound, Akira said softly, if they are made with silence. She looked at him. Can you teach me? He paused for a long time. Then, with a slow breath, he opened his box. He took out a small inkstone and ground the ink. Slowly, deliberately, like someone kneeling before an altar. Then he placed a brush in her hand. Her fingers trembled. Don't try to draw your mother's voice, he said. Just feel it. Yui closed her eyes. She remembered the lullabies, the warmth of her mother's hand on her forehead, the way her voice lifted like a bird and fell like rain. Then she drew one long curving stroke across the paper. It was not beautiful. It was uneven, uncertain. But it was real. Akira nodded. For the next month, they met each morning. He did not give her lessons in the traditional sense. There were no lectures on stroke, order, or proportion. Instead, he asked questions. What does grief look like as a line? How does wind bend without breaking? If stillness had a shape, what would it be? She painted. She failed. She cried. She laughed. And slowly her brush grew steadier. Her lines grew strange, graceful, like reeds in a current dot. Then, one morning, she arrived and found Akira already painting. His arm moved like a branch in wind measured, patient, alive. The scroll before him held a single character. Mu, nothingness, it. Pulsed on the page like a bell that had just rung. She watched in awe. He turned to her and said, "The wind returned." She smiled, then frowned. Why did it leave? Akira looked at the sky. Because I clung too tightly to meaning. I tried to say too much, when the truth was in the space between words. She nodded, though she only half understood. Still, it felt true. Then he handed her a scroll. It was blank. This is for your mother, he said. You will know when to begin. Yui held the scroll as if it were sacred. That afternoon, Akira walked into the village for the first time in years. He visited the shrine, bought sweet rice cakes, and greeted the elders. They welcomed him cautiously, but he only smiled, bowed, and said, "The wind is teaching again." In the months that followed, Akira and Yui began a tradition. Every seventh day, they would hang a new scroll outside his cottage. Each bore a single character, some known, some invented. People came from the village to see, then from neighboring towns. No fanfare, no market, no price. The characters spoke in silence. One day, a traveler from the city arrived, a gallery owner. He recognized Akira and offered to buy every scroll, commissioned dozens more. Host an exhibition in Tokyo, Akira declined. These words are not for keeping, he said. They are for letting go. The traveler left, confused and disappointed. Years passed, Yui grew. Her brushstrokes grew bolder. People began to call her Little Wind, and when Akira grew too frail to lift his brush, he asked Yui to paint with him one last time. Together, they painted a scroll that held no ink, just the impressions of their brushes moving across the page, dragging breath and memory into Blankness. It was called Whisper. When Akira passed, the villagers held no funeral at his request. They hung Whisper on the gate of his cottage, where the wind could lift it each morning like a prayer to soft phalangish. And Yui, now grown, continued the tradition. Not for fame, not for art, but for the soundless voices carried by wind. Her scrolls were not always understood, but those who saw them felt something move inside them, something forgotten yet familiar. A few called it Zen, others called it beauty. Yui knew it by the name her teacher gave it, Silence Learning How to Sing. Story 21. The River That Forgets in a Quiet Village Cradled by Two Mountains. There was a river that everyone feared, not for its strength, but for its silence. It ran clear and cold, winding through the fields like a silver thread, but no one dared bathe in it or drink from it. The elders said it was cursed, that the river was born of forgotten sorrow, and those who touched it would forget the ones they loved. But old tales fade like footprints in rain, and most villagers no longer remembered the origin of the warning. Still, they stayed away. Crops were watered with well water, and children were warned with firm voices and trembling eyes. Do not go near the river. Yet as in all stories, there was someone who disobeyed. A boy named Kato, 12 winters old, lived with his grandmother on the edge of the village. His parents had died in a fire when he was a baby, and he had grown up with the scent of ashes stitched into his dreams. His grandmother, Haru, was a gentlewoman, bent like a willow but strong in spirit. She told him stories every night of fox spirits, monks who walked on clouds, and of course, the river that forgets. Unlike the other children, Kato did not fear the river. He watched it from the window as he ate his breakfast, the way it curved, like a question mark around the fields, glittering under the sun like it had secrets. He felt drawn to it, as if something inside it whispered his name. One morning, he asked his grandmother, Oba, why does the river make people forget? She stirred the rice porridge with a wooden spoon, eyes distant. Because some memories, way too much, the river takes them so the heart can breathe again. Kato frowned. But what if I don't want to forget? Then you must not touch the water, she said. Not even a drop. But children are curious. And sorrow has its own gravity. One evening, after a quarrel with his schoolmates who teased him for being strange, for not knowing his father's name, for always sitting along, Kato wandered toward the river. The sky was melting into twilight, and fireflies blinked like silent bells in the grass. He stood at the edge of the bank and listened. The river made no sound, no ripple, no splash, just stillness. He crouched down and looked into it. His reflection stared back, eyes darker than he remembered. He thought of his mother's voice, which he could no longer recall. He thought of his father's face, which he had never seen. A wind brushed his cheek, and something inside him ached. He reached out. One finger touched the surface. A single ring expanded outward, disappearing into the distance. The moment passed. Nothing changed. No thunder, no flash of light. But when he stood up and walked back, the village seemed less familiar. The path to his home looked longer, the air thinner. When he entered his cottage, his grandmother looked at him strangely. She asked. He smiled. Oba, I'm back. But she did not smile. Her eyes welled with tears. Who are you? She whispered. Kato's stomach dropped. He laughed nervously. It's me, Kato. She backed away. My grandson died 5 years ago in the fire. Kato froze. What are you talking about? She pointed at the wall. There, in a dusty frame, was a photograph of a boy him, or someone like him, with the date of his death etched below. But, I'm here, he said. His grandmother collapsed into a chair, trembling. You're not him, you're not. Next morning, he left. The village did not recognize him. No one called his name. Children ignored him. The shopkeeper stared at him like a ghost. Even the dog that used to follow him barked and ran away. The river had taken him, or rather, taken his place, Confused and frightened, he wandered the woods for days. Hunger clawed at his stomach, but worse was the emptiness in his chest. He slept under trees and drank rainwater from leaves. He no longer knew who he was. Even his own name felt foreign on his tongue. One night he met a monk. The monk wore a robe the color of dusk and sat beside a fire in a clearing, brewing tea in a cracked pot. His eyes were old, but not tired. When Kato stumbled into the light, the monk simply gestured for him to sit. They did not speak for a long time. Then Kato asked, "Do you know the river?" The monk nodded. "The river that forgets. Why? Does it take memory?" "It doesn't take," the monk said. "It offers, but I didn't want to forget. I only touched it for a moment." The monk poured tea into 2 wooden cups. "When your heart carries pain you do not understand, it seeks relief without asking your mind." Kato drank. The tea was bitter but warm. "I want to remember again," he said. The monk looked into the fire. "Then you must go to the source. Source, where the river begins, before memory and forgetting. But I don't know the way." "You will," the monk said, and pointed east. For 3 days, Kato traveled through fog and forest. He crossed routes that looked like hands and climbed rocks that tore his feet. He ate nothing, drank dew, and followed the river upstream, watching it narrow into a silver thread. On the 4th day, he reached a cave hidden behind a curtain of ivy. The river trickled from its mouth, gentle as breath. He stepped inside. Air was cold and thick. The walls shimmered with wet light. At the very heart of the cave, a small pool glowed faintly. The water was so still it looked like glass. He knelt in the pool. He saw not his reflection but memories. His mother cradling him, her voice humming lullabies. His father carrying him on his shoulders, pointing at birds. His grandmother laughing as she sewed a patch onto his torn shirt. His schoolmates, his tears, his loneliness, and then his own hand reaching for the river. He wept. The water shimmered then, as if pulled by something greater than will. He dipped both hands into the pool, and suddenly he remembered everything, not just the memories. The river had taken, but those he had buried. The smell of smoke, the scream in his mother's voice, the heat of flames, the silence that followed. He remembered holding guilt like a stone. He remembered thinking, "I should have died with them." And then he remembered the wind, how it had lifted the smoke, how it had whispered to him. Liv, when he opened his eyes, was still in the cave, but the pain no longer crushed him. It lived beside him, not inside. He stood and walked back to the village. When he returned, no one recognized him, but he no longer needed them to. He found his grandmother sitting by the fire, eyes half closed. He sat beside her and took her hand. She looked at him and smiled faintly. "Kato." He nodded. She did not ask how. She only wept, and this time held him. Years passed. Kato became a healer, not of bodies, but of stories. Those who lost themselves came to him, and he listened. He did not give answers, only presence. Sometimes he took them to the river, not to forget, but to remember what they had once buried, because in the end, the river was never cursed. It was a mirror, and only those who truly wished to see themselves dared touch its surface. Story 22. The Bamboo Grove of Midnight Voices. There was a small monastery on the edge of a vast bamboo forest, where the wind never ceased to whisper. Locals called it the Grove of Midnight Voices. Some said it was haunted, others said it was blessed, but few dared enter after dusk, for they believed the voices belonged to souls who had never found peace, yet nestled at the border of the grove. The monks of Yoran Temple lived without fear. They swept the temple floor at dawn, chanted through the daylight hours, and sat in meditation long after the moon had risen. They had grown used to the murmurs in the wind. Some even said it calmed them, like a lullaby sung by the earth. Among the monks was a young man named Ren. He had come to the temple as a boy of 7, after his parents vanished in the forest. No one knew exactly what had happened. They had gone in one afternoon, looking for rare herbs to treat an illness, and never returned. The villagers searched for days, but the forest yielded nothing. No tracks, no belongings, not even footprints in the moss. Only Ren had come back. He remembered running, barefoot and bleeding, his voice hoarse from screaming, but everything before that was a fog. He could not recall his parents' faces, only the warmth of his mother's hand, the sound of his father's humming. He grew up among the monks, quiet and obedient. He studied scripture, tended the garden, and walked the meditation path lined with ancient stones. But the grove always called to him. Night. He would lie awake and listen. The wind that blew through the bamboo was like breath, soft, rhythmic, eternal. Sometimes it sounded like laughter, sometimes like weeping. Once it even whispered his name. Still, he never ventured past the lantern-lit paths, until the night the stranger came. It was just past twilight when a traveler arrived at the temple gates. His robe was tattered, and his hair had grown wild. But his posture was upright, his eyes burning with quiet intensity. He bowed deeply, requesting shelter for the night. Master Dago, the temple's abbot, welcomed him with grace. As custom dictated, the monks offered him tea and a place by the hearth. The traveler drank in silence. Then he asked a strange question. "Do you believe the forest has memory?" The monks exchanged glances. Some laughed softly, others said, "Nothing." Master Dago replied, "The forest reflects what you carry within. If your heart is heavy, it will echo sorrow. If your heart is clear, it will mirror clarity." The traveler smiled without joy. "Then may I ask to walk the bamboo path alone tonight?" The request was unusual, even forbidden, but Dago simply nodded, "As you wish. But remember, the grove listens." That night, Ren lay in his small room, eyes wide open. He felt something shift. The wind no longer whispered. It waited, drawn by instinct more than thought. Ren left his mat and walked barefoot to the edge of the bamboo grove. The moon floated above the canopy, casting long silver shadows on the stone path. The stranger was already there, standing motionless. Eyes closed, Ren watched from a distance, unsure why he had followed. Then the stranger opened his eyes and spoke. "Your parents were kind," he said, without turning. Ren froze. "I knew them. Long ago, before they entered this forest." "How do you know me?" Ren whispered. "I was with them. I saw what happened, and I returned." Ren stepped closer. "You returned." The stranger nodded. "But I did not remember, not at first. The forest took it from me, just as it did from you." Ren's heart pounded. Why? Because we carried pain too heavy for one life. The forest hid it, protected us. But now the time has come to see. Stranger reached into his sleeve and pulled out a small flute, carved from dark bamboo. He placed it to his lips and played a single, trembling note. The air, Quivered. Suddenly, the grove was alive. The wind stirred. The bamboo swayed not with the breeze, but with purpose, as if they breathed in unison. From all sides came voices not ghostly, but human. Fragments of lullabies, echoes of laughter, murmured names and memories. Ren dropped to his knees. He saw flashes his mother's smile, the green scarf she wore, his father kneeling by a stream, calling his name. Then screams, running, a man with cold eyes, fire, smoke, then silence. Ren sobbed, but the tears were not just of pain, they were release. The stranger lowered the flute. The grove does not forget. It holds what we fear to carry. Ren looked at him. You were the one who led them. I was their guide, he said. But I was also the one who betrayed them. Ren's eyes widened. I owed a debt, the man said. And to repay it, I revealed the secret path. Bandits followed. They thought your parents carried gold, not medicine. Ren's breath caught. You let them die? I tried to stop it, the stranger said, voice breaking. But fear is a sharp blade. I ran, and the grove took my memory. Out of mercy, Ren stood, trembling. Then why come back? To remember, to atone. The stranger handed Ren the flute. You are the son of kindness. Let your voice join the grove. Ren hesitated, then took it. He placed the flute to his lips and played. At first, only broken tones. But slowly, the notes found their shapes, soft and steady. The forest responded, a harmony rising from the earth itself. In that moment, Ren did not remember pain. He remembered love, a family who risked everything to help others, a boy who survived not by chance, but by grace. When the song ended, the grove stilled. The stranger bowed low. Thank you, he said. Now I may go in peace. Ren did not stop him. The next morning, the monks found Ren sitting alone at the forest's edge, the flute resting beside him. He said nothing, but his eyes were clear, like a sky after storm. From that day, he began walking into the forest at dusk, not to forget, but to listen. And slowly others followed. Grieving widows, lost children, soldiers with haunted eyes. Each one found the grove not cursed, but sacred. For the bamboo grove of midnight voices did not speak of death. It sang of memory, and of the courage to remember what love leaves behind. Story 23. The clay boulder village of Sakuda was tucked between two mountain ranges, sheltered by pine forests and known for its old traditions. Life in Sakuda flowed slowly, like the river that wound past, its fields steady, seasonal, and serene. In the center of the village stood a small temple, humble in size, but rich in stories. The villagers believed that peace reigned in Sakuda because of the old monk who lived there. His name was Jain. He was not the abbot, nor had he ever taken a title of great esteem. But the people sought him when grief knocked or storms struck. They said he spoke little, but when he did, his words planted seeds that grew slowly, like pine trees quiet, strong and lasting. Guinan was old. His robes were patched with care. His hands, calloused from years of sweeping the temple grounds, held the softness of one who had let go of desire. He spent his days in silence, sitting beside a clay bowl he had made in his youth. The bowl was plain, its color dull brown, but it had one fine golden line running along a crack that had been mended long ago. When villagers asked about it, he would only smile and say, "This bowl once held emptiness. Now it holds the sky." No one understood. One spring, a man arrived in Sakuda, worn by dust and debt. His name was Kato, and though young in years, he walked with the gait of one who had carried burdens too long. He had once been a merchant, proud and rich, until drought ruined his crops. A fire consumed his warehouse, and his family left him. He now owned nothing but regret and the clothes on his back. He came to the temple because he had nowhere else to go. Guinan opened the gate without asking a single question. He offered Kato rice, water, and a place to sleep on the temple porch. That night, as frogs sang by the pond, Kato lay awake, his thoughts a swirl of shame. The next morning, Guinan handed him a broom. No words, Kato asked, half smiling. Guinan merely pointed to the path, thick with fallen petals. So Kato swept. The breeze carried the cherry blossoms like confetti of remembrance. And in that soft ritual of movement and rhythm, his breath slowed. He stayed. A day, then another. Days became weeks. He repaired broken wooden steps, learned to cook simple meals, fetched water from the well, and joined Guinan in evening meditation. He didn't know what he was waiting for, only that for the first time in years, the silence around him didn't feel like punishment. One afternoon, while cleaning the storage room, Kato found a pile of cracked bowls and cups. Some were in shards, others missing pieces. He stared at them, puzzled, and brought them to Guinan. "These are broken," Kato said. "Should I throw them out?" Guinan took one piece, a cup split in half, and examined it like a rare jewel. "Breakage is not the end," he said. Kato laughed. "It is for pottery." Guinan shook his head and, for the first time in weeks, spoke a longer sentence. "In Japan, we mend broken ceramics with lacquer mixed with gold. It's called kintsugi. The crack is not hidden, it is honored." Kato looked at him, eyes narrowing. "Why would you highlight what's broken? To show that it healed." He took the cup inside, sat at a small table, and began the slow process of mending it. Days passed as he applied layers of golden resin with steady hands. Kato watched, captivated. When it was done, the cup gleamed not, despite the crack, but because of it. Guinan set it next to his clay bowl. "They belong together," he said. That night, Kato lay awake again, but something had changed. He thought of the fire that had ruined him, the betrayal of friends, the bitterness in his chest. Could it be mended, too? The next morning, he asked Guinan, "What if some things break beyond repair?" Guinan replied, "Then they become part of your shape." Kato furrowed his brow. "Like the scar on my hand, like the scar on your soul." Guinan said. Kato thought of all he had tried to erase, his mistakes, his anger, his longing. He had tried to become someone else, anyone else. But what if the path forward was not to forget, but to accept? That day, he asked to learn the art of kintsugi. Guinan taught him with patience, showing how to gather dust from old bowls, mix it with sap and powder, wait for it to cure. The process was slow, almost meditative. Each broken cup became a testament to survival, and slowly, something shifted within Kato. He began walking into the village again, not with shame, but with quiet curiosity. He helped repair a fence for an elderly woman, fixed a wheelbarrow for a farmer. He didn't speak much, but his presence grew familiar. The villagers, sensing the change, no longer asked where he came from. One day, a boy came to the temple, holding a broken toy his father had made. The boy was crying. "Can it be fixed?" he asked. Kato knelt and studied the toy. It was wooden, hand-carved, its leg cracked, but intact. "With time," he said. He stayed up late that night, working by lamplight, remembering the way his father once fixed a paper kite for him, long ago. When he returned the toy, the boy beamed, and Kato felt something lift a thread of joy, thin but real. That spring passed, and so did another. Kato never left the temple. He no longer feared the cracks in his past. He welcomed them, and won. Daijinin called him to the inner room. The old monk handed him the clay bowl, the one with the golden line. "It's yours," he said. Kato held it carefully. "But why?" "Because it knows what you know now." He looked at the bowl, its imperfect shape, the smooth texture of its mended scar. It felt warm, as if holding it meant holding years of silence, sorrow, and grace. Guinan passed away that winter, peacefully and without pain. The villagers gathered in quiet reverence. They did not mourn loudly, for Jinon had taught them that nothing truly ends. Kato became the keeper of the temple, though he never took a title. He simply swept the grounds, listened to the wind, and taught anyone who asked how to mend what was broken. The clay bowl sat at the altar. Sometimes visitors would ask about the golden line, and Kato would say, "This bowl once held emptiness. Now it holds the sky." Story 24. The river inside the stone there was once a stonemason named Haru, who lived in a quiet mountain town. Every morning, he walked down the slope to the riverbed, where he spent his days chiseling blocks of stone for bridges, walls, and shrines. His hands were thick with calluses, his shoulders bowed from years of lifting granite, and his voice had the rasp of one who seldom used it. Haru lived alone, not out of bitterness, but out of a quiet pact he had made with the world. He had once loved deeply and lost. Since then, he had chosen stillness over company. The villagers respected him. His stones never cracked in the rain, and his carvings, though simple, had an integrity that endured seasons and sorrow. Yet no one truly knew him. He was a man who listened more than he spoke, who sat beside boulders as if they whispered secrets. One summer, the town was struck by a strange drought. The river that once surged and sang through the valley was now a thin ribbon of dust. The leaves curled early, wells ran dry, and the temple's stone fountain fell silent. But what disturbed the people more was not the absence of water. It was the absence of birdsong. The swallows that nested in the cliffs had disappeared, and, with them, the music of dawn. The elders called it an omen. The priest burned incense and prayed. The farmers dug deeper, yet none of their efforts stirred the sky. One morning, Haru found a boy sitting on the rock near his workshop. The child was thin, barefoot, and dusty. His eyes, large and solemn, watched Haru without flinching. "Are you lost?" Haru asked. The boy shook his head, hungry, another shake. "What do you want?" The boy pointed to a large stone in the yard. It was rough, uncut, and twice his size. "There is a river inside," the boy said. Har. You stared at the stone. It was solid granite, grey and veined. "A river." The boy nodded. "If you free it, the drought will end." Haru frowned, unsure whether the child was mad or dreaming. "Stones don't hold rivers," he said. The boy's voice was soft. "Some do, but only those who listen can find them." Before Haru could reply, the child turned and walked away. The next morning, the boy returned and sat silently on the same rock. Haru ignored him at first, but by midday, something in the boy's gaze unsettled him. It wasn't pleading or mischief. It was conviction. He approached the stone, the one the boy had pointed at, and ran his hand along its surface. It was old, flecked with lichen, and weathered by decades of wind. There was nothing unusual about it, except perhaps its silence. Even among stones, it felt especially still. "Why this one?" Haru asked. The boy looked up. because it's waiting. That night, Haru couldn't sleep. The words echoed. A river inside. A stone that's waiting. He dreamed of water locked in stone, of fish swimming through granite, of clouds weeping into rock and never escaping. The next day, he brought out his tools. It had been years since Haru had carved without commission. His work had always been for others, for temples, bridges, graves. Now, with no payment and no purpose, he began to chip away at the stone. He did not shape it into anything. He merely followed what he thought might be cracks, curves, whispers. Each strike of the chisel was careful, each flake of granite a mystery. He worked not with design, but with attention. The boy watched in silence. Days passed. Then weeks. Villagers began to talk. They came to see the stone. To them, it looked the same. Pointless. A madman's obsession. But Haru continued. He no longer noticed their stares. What changed was not the stone, but Haru. He began to listen, to wait before each strike. He watched the way light danced across the ridges, the way shadows formed in tiny crevices. He felt, for the first time in years, a sense of connection not just to the stone, but to himself. And slowly, the stone began to hollow, not as a pot or sculpture, but as a basin shaped, like a pool curled inward. The deeper he carved, the cooler. It felt he used no water, yet his hands remained damp. Then one morning, Haru struck a layer that sounded different. The sound was hollow, like tapping bone instead of muscle. He chipped further and a fine crack opened. From that crack, a single bead of moisture glimmered. He paused. Another drop followed, and another, by dusk. A small trickle had formed in the basin of the stone. The boy smiled. "You found it," he said. "But how?" Haru whispered. "There was no spring beneath." "I checked." The boy said nothing. That night, rain came. It wasn't heavy or loud, just a soft, steady weeping from the sky. By dawn, the stone basin was full. Birds returned. Leaves brightened. The river downstream, for the first time in months, stirred with movement. People came again, but now not to mock, to marvel. They called it the Well of Listening. Haru said little. He only tended to the stone, cleaning the moss gently, letting the water speak for itself. The boy never returned. Some say he was a spirit. Others say he was just a child with a vision. But Haru believed he was a teacher. Years later, when Haru passed away, the villagers placed his ashes beneath the stone. A plaque was added with no name, just a simple line. Inside every stone, a river waits. And from that day on, whenever someone in the village felt broken, confused, or empty, they came to the basin, placed their hand in the cool water, and waited not for answers, but for silence deep enough to hear the river inside themselves. Story 25. The silent drum in the northern province of the realm, where mountains rose like ancient sentinels and mists clung to pine-covered cliffs, there lived a monk named Tetsu. Unlike the revered abbots or eloquent teachers, Tetsu was known only for his silence. He had taken the vow of non-speech 10 years prior, not as a test of discipline, but as a refuge. No one remembered hearing his voice, not even when he had first arrived at the monastery. As a young man with haunted eyes and trembling hands, Tetsu was assigned to care for the old drum in the meditation hall. It was a ceremonial object, cracked, with age and rarely touched. Still, Tetsu would clean it daily, oil the wood, tighten its fraying cords, and sit before it in prayer as if it held a living spirit. The drum never made a sound, not even during rituals. It was said that it had not been struck for over a century. After the great flood that washed away half the village and drowned the old master, who used to beat it each morning to summon the monks, no one dared strike the drum since. Some feared it was cursed. Others thought the silence of the drum was a sacred symbol, a reminder that some sounds are not meant for this world. Tetsu never said a word, but each morning he bowed to it as if greeting an elder, and each evening he sat with it as one might sit beside a grieving friend. It was the 7th winter since Tetsu had come to the monastery, and the cold was harsher than the elders remembered. Snow fell like ash. The wind howled through the mountain passes with the cries of lost spirits. Supplies from the lowlands had been delayed, and food stores dwindled. The young monks began to shiver in their robes during morning chants, and the old ones murmured about signs, bad omens, tests of the Dharma, or perhaps karmic debt returning in the wind. Then the child arrived. A stranger found him curled at the temple gate, barely breathing, wrapped in a bloodied blanket. His skin was pale blue, his lips cracked. The monks took him in, tended to his wounds, and fed him warm broth. He did not speak, but his eyes, wide and black as onyx, followed everything, watchful, afraid, and strangely wise. When asked where he came from, the boy only pointed toward the northern cliffs. But there were no villages beyond that ridge, only caves and the ruined remnants of an old warrior monastery, said to have burned in a war many decades ago. The child was housed in the monks' quarters near the hearth, but at night he would often slip away, barefoot and silent, and make his way to the meditation hall. There he sat before the silent drum, opposite Tetsu. Neither of them spoke. They sat for hours, two shadows divided by a wooden relic, as the wind screamed outside. Flame of the lone lantern flickered between them. The boy never smiled, but he never cried either. One night, after the storm had raged for 3 days and the monks grew weak from hunger, a sound broke the silence. It was a single, deep thrum resonant, like the belly of thunder rolled through wood and bone. The monks rushed from their rooms, barefoot on the cold floor, robes flapping in the wind. In the meditation hall, they found the child standing before the drum, his small hands resting on the rim. Tetsu was behind him, eyes closed, face pale. The monks gasped. The drum had been struck. But by whom? The boy looked up. Then, for the first time, he spoke. "There is a storm greater than this," he said, "but you have forgotten how to listen." The monks fell silent. The boy stepped back and let the room still again. From that night, the drum was no longer forbidden, but no one dared touch it except the boy. He struck it once each morning. Then each time a different sound came. Sometimes it was a deep groan, like the shifting of the earth. Other times it was a soft beat, like a heart lost in prayer. And sometimes it made no sound at all, and yet everyone who heard the silence would feel as though something had been said to them alone. Under the boy's presence, the mood of the temple changed. Though food was still scarce, the monks no longer spoke of hunger. With despair, they shared smaller portions, fasted together, and chanted longer into the night. Even the sickest among them seemed to glow faintly, as if some invisible warmth had begun to pulse through the walls. One evening, as snow began to melt into the mountain paths and spring teased the air, the boy approached Tetsu. The monk was sweeping the courtyard in silence, as always. "You know the drum, don't you?" the boy asked Tetsu. Looked at him. "You knew it before it came here." Tetsu nodded. The boy did not seem surprised. My mother used to sing beside a drum like that, he said. Before the fire, Tetsu paused. The boy continued, she said. Each drumbeat calls the soul back to where it forgot itself. Tetsu's eyes lowered. The boy reached into his robe and pulled out a small carved bead. It was worn and blackened with age. He placed it in Tetsu's hand. It was hers, he whispered. Now it's yours. That night, Tetsu returned to the drum alone. He knelt before it, the bead in his palm, and whispered for the first time in 10 years, I remember. Then he struck the drum. This time, the sound was not thunder or heart or earth. It was wind-soft and slow, like breath over stone. The monks said the snow melted early that year. Birds returned before the blossoms. The boy vanished one morning, as quietly as he had come. His robes were folded neatly by the drum, and the bead he had given, Tetsu, now hung from the drum's rim dot, Tets. You never spoke again. But each dawn he struck the drum, one sound, the valley listened. Even travelers from far provinces would come, not to hear the sound, but to feel what could not be heard. They said it wasn't the drum that spoke, but the silence it made sacred, and in that silence they remembered themselves. So ends the last tale for Nuve, the quiet ones who speak through. Stillness of rivers inside stones, of drums that echo storms, and of hearts that beat not to be heard, but to be known. If you've journeyed with us this far, thank you for opening your heart to these quiet tales. In each story, we hope you've discovered more than just words. Perhaps a reflection, a breath, a stillness that lingers after the sound fades. We would love to know what stirred within you. Did a particular story speak to your present moment? Did a silence echo something you've long carried? Your thoughts and reflections are not only welcome, they are the lifeblood of this shared space. Please leave a comment, share your insights, or tell us which story stayed with you. If these moments of calm and clarity brought something meaningful to your day, we invite you to like the video, share it with those who may also need a pause, and subscribe to The Empty Boat for more journeys inward. The boat is empty, but it is not alone. It floats with you, and it waits gently for your return.